This is Sycamore X, written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by Stephen Barnett. Introduction. Sycamore X is a 10-story companion collection to the two Sycamore novels. The novels focused on Kurt Jacobs, whose own focus was on the rapid changes taking place on a societal level. This didn't leave much room to explore how the seed and ultra lenses were affecting the day-to-day lives of ordinary individuals. That's where Sycamore X comes in. These 10 stories, which occur in the same general time frame as the novels, focus mainly on new characters and their experiences in Sycamore's brave new world. This collection also includes an exclusive bonus story, Funscreen Redux, the sequel to 2013's acclaimed Funscreen. People who have read the novels will naturally get a lot more out of this companion collection than people who haven't. In any case, all readers will need a basic understanding of the core tech. Here's a quick rundown/recap. Ultra lenses. Sycamore's groundbreaking augmented reality contact lenses. Powerful and discreet, the ultra lenses can overlay data in a consumer's vision or fully immerse them in vivid, virtual surroundings indistinguishable from reality. The seed. Sycamore's implantable microchip. Implanted in the consumer's left hand, the seed turns their palm into a touch-based trackpad. The seed's computational power and intuitive input method combines with the ultra lens's flawless display to create the ultimate human-computer interface. Thanks to a combination of masterful marketing, political corruption, and fortuitous timing, Sycamore's market penetration is near total. As such, the following stories occur in a world and time in which it's safe to assume that everyone is seated and everyone is wearing lenses. Welcome to Sycamore. Enjoy the view. Story 1. Lance. For several weeks, Monday nights had been the only thing keeping Lance's bar in business. In an era when more people than ever did their drinking at home now that they could fully immerse themselves in whatever kind of augmented reality they so pleased, the pre-existing contractual restrictions on live sports broadcasting were a godsend for Lance. This Monday night, like every other, brought out the usual dozen or so football-watching regulars. These football fans were the largest loose group in the bar, outnumbering by almost 2-to-1 the real regulars who spent more of their waking hours at Lance's than they did at home. The members of this second group had all been relatively late adopters of Sycamore's world-changing technologies. But the ultra lenses and seed had become so necessary so quickly that even these grizzled old relics, some of whom had never previously owned so much as a smartphone, were now firmly on board. Though boosted by world-class marketing and shady behind-the-curtain dealings, Sycamore's unprecedented levels of market penetration rested upon a combination of brilliant launch-day software and surprisingly unobtrusive hardware. Just months earlier, the idea of wearing contact lenses all day and walking around with a microchip implanted in their palms would have sounded as appealing to Lance's regulars as a 5-day juice cleanse. Now, though, they all appreciated that the ultra lenses were literally incomparable to off-the-shelf contacts, and that the seed was small enough to be forgotten about within minutes of the injection. In an attempt to swell his customer base beyond these two groups of variably committed regulars, and to prepare for life after the football season, Lance had recently moved way outside his comfort zone and applied for an REV license from Sycamore. By cementing the bar as a registered entertainment venue, this successful application unlocked a myriad of crowd-pleasing gimmicks. Even under the 4-year lease option, however, Lance could only afford one of them. Knowing that the bar would be out of business within 4 years if he didn't try something, he shook off his fears and went for it. Before signing the 4-year lease to bring RealU freedom to his bar, Lance didn't even know what the hell RealU was. As a man of his age and social standing, Sycamore hadn't identified him as a likely user, and so hadn't delivered any ads about the service's launch. When Lance read about RealU, an app which blurred the line between augmented and virtual reality by allowing consumers to modify their real-world appearance like characters in a video game. He was astounded by the figures Sycamore provided. 89% of 18 to 24-year-olds had already used the service, with 52% having paid for one or more premium modifications. Lance signed the lease on the spot. RealU Freedom offered consumers a unique opportunity. When inside a registered entertainment venue with the appropriate lease, they could experience everything RealU had to offer, from a change of shoe color to a full-scale makeover, completely free of charge. All modifications would wear off when the consumer left the venue, of course, but they would be visible to everyone else inside for the duration of their visit. After just 3 days, RealU Freedom was already proving an effective selling point for Lance's bar. Rather than the whole bar, Lance made the atypical decision to establish one corner as the so-called Freedom Zone. He did this for one simple reason: so he could charge an entry fee. To get around the pesky terms and conditions of his Sycamore lease, which outright forbade such a charge, Lance cordoned off the Freedom Zone and enacted a 4-drink minimum for anyone who wished to sit at one of its 2 tables. The location-based technology behind RealU Freedom was a natural progression from the kind of micro-location geofencing that countless retailers had used to analyze customer behavior in the pre-Sycamore days. Because it was all so straightforward, Lance could extend or move the boundaries of the zone with just a few clicks. RealU Freedom worked for Lance by bringing in a different crowd, and it worked for Sycamore by acting as something of a gateway drug for consumers who would leave the Freedom Zone with a taste for RealU and a newfound determination to save up for imperfection-killing modifications, which would work as well in the real world as they did in the zone. Consumers tended to gravitate towards novelty modifications when they first experienced free reign in RealU, with accessories like devil horns and vampire fangs particularly popular. But before long, almost everyone ended up navigating the more insidious corrections menu. Nose too big? Hair too gray? Teeth too yellow? Have no fear, the tagline said. Perfection is just one click away. When Lance's regulars tried RealU Freedom on the first night, they had an unexpectedly great time messing around with the options. They laughed and joked with each other more than Lance had ever seen, but none caught the bug. Well past caring about how they looked, these men were quite plainly the furthest thing from RealU's target demographic. Tonight, the group in the zone could hardly have been more different. Both tables inside the Freedom Zone were full, as a group of 8 young men and women celebrated a 21st birthday in a unique and enjoyable way. None of Lance's regulars complained about the noise from the party group, understanding perfectly well that he was in no position to turn away anyone's custom. The birthday girl looked much younger than 21, but another benefit of the seed was that it did away with any doubt in such situations. Like everyone else's, her name, age, relationship, and work status were all displayed beside her head whenever a lens wearer's eyes lingered for more than a passing glance. Jasmine Coulson, 21, single, student. Lance lifted 4 empty bottles and wiped the bar surface in front of 2 steady-drinking football fans. These 2 young men, boys compared to the rest of his clientele, had become reliable fixtures at the bar. Having started out as Monday nighters, they now stopped by for a few hours almost every evening. Lance didn't know much about either of them beyond the only 2 things that mattered. They were quiet, and they were thirsty. Something seemed different about the boys tonight. They were as engrossed in the game as any other Monday night and as thirsty as ever, but the thinner of the 2 had been paying for both of their drinks all night. Lance knew from repeated eye contact over the course of the evening so far that the thin guy's name was Nick. When the time came for the next order, Lance heard Nick's friend asking him whether Sycamore's daily credit limits reset at midnight or operated on a rolling 24-hour basis. Nick didn't know. "It's rolling," Lance answered, regrettably familiar with the system. He handed the boys 2 more beers. Nick held his hand out to receive the payment pad, but Lance shook his head. "On the house." "Thanks a lot," Nick said. Lance shrugged. "It's nothing." Nothing but smart, he thought to himself. These boys had the potential to become two of his best customers, so a few unexpected freebies here and there would be well worth it as an investment to turn their regularity into loyalty. "Seriously, man," Nick's friend said. "Thanks." Lance looked into the boy's eyes. Jason Moss, 22, single, fast food worker. Jason wore a baggy black t-shirt featuring a huge Lexington logo. "Is that an ad shirt, or are you actually wearing it?" Lance asked. "Ad," Jason said, looking down at it. "From the ad section in RealU. I'm still wearing my work uniform in real life." Lance had already seen enough since signing the RealU Freedom Lease to know how impressive RealU's rendering engine was, but it never failed to impress him just how flawless the garments and modifications looked even at close range. "Do Lexington pay you for wearing it?" "That's the theory," Jason said. He took a long drink. "How much?" "Practically nothing. Look at my GSV." Lance's expression went blank. "I don't really know about that stuff." "My gross social value stat," Jason explained. "You have to click into my forest profile to see it. If I had higher value, I'd get paid a lot more per ad impression." "So it works per impression. You get paid more if more people see it?" Jason nodded while gulping down another third of his beer. He wiped his mouth with his hand. "And I get more again if they engage. So if you were to look at the Lexington logo for more than a second, my reward would go up. And if someone says Lexington while they're looking at my shirt, it goes up again. The highest reward comes if someone actually buys Lexington within an hour of seeing it. It works pretty much like online affiliate links used to. That's why I picked this ad for tonight, because everyone here is drinking Lexington anyway." "I've got an idea," Lance said. He called over to his regulars, who had no interest in the football. "Guys, take a look at this kid's shirt and say Lexington." "Why?" one asked, quite reasonably. "Just do it." All of the men looked over. A few spoke. After 8 impressions and 3 engagements, Jason checked his ad report and sighed. "If they do that every night for the next month, I'll almost be able to buy myself a beer." "That's all," Lance said, incredulous. Jason shrugged. "It's because I'm no one. Thanks for trying, though. If I was famous, it would be lucrative as hell. It's just like real life. A celebrity endorsement has always been worth a lot more than mine." "Rich get richer," Lance said. "Always have, always will." At halftime, an ad for the SycaLotto played on Lance's big screen. The ad promised that the next draw was imminent and advised consumers to be ready. Each SycaLotto draw actually comprised of 3 separate draws conducted back-to-back. Every consumer was automatically entered into the first draw, which had a guaranteed winner every time. The regular SycaLotto then followed, with 1 jackpot winner and 1 runner-up. Consumers could buy as many extra tickets for the regular draws as they wished. The preliminary free draw was Sycamore's latest way to ensure that consumers wore their Ultra lenses at all times. With draw times unannounced and a claims window of just 30 seconds, no one could afford to miss out. "I guess it makes sense to do it at halftime," Jason said. Nick nodded in agreement. "No one wins anyway," Lance said. "The SycaLotto's a scam." This comment made Jason smile. "If it's such a scam, why did you buy 3 tickets for the main draw?" Lance's expression stiffened. "How the hell do you know that?" "Syca Stats," Jason said. "It's the flash deal in the Syca store, free for 2 hours. Go to the app section and it's right there. It'll delete itself after 2 hours unless you subscribe, but I heard that Sycamore sometimes do special offers for people who download a lot of flash deals, so you should check it out." "It's not great," Nick chimed in. "I thought it would unlock loads of data, but all it shows is the stuff you can already see about your forest friends. It kinda defeats the purpose when it doesn't tell you anything new about the people you know." "Still worth checking out," Jason said. Lance navigated through the Syca store's intuitive menu system and activated the Syca Stats trial. Looking around the bar, the first thing Lance checked was how many SycaLotto tickets his customers had bought. Immediately after selecting this option, he saw a large white number appear above each of their heads. Premium Sycamore features allowed users to cloak their order histories when it came to things like gambling and adult media. But Lance knew that the kind of people who bought lottery tickets weren't usually the kind who could afford to enable these expensive privacy settings. None of the birthday group in the Freedom Zone had purchased any entries for the main SycaLotto draw. Lance's regulars had an average of 2 or 3. Nick had 4. When Lance's gaze reached Jason, he saw the number 29. "You bought 29 tickets? No wonder you maxed your credit limit." "It's the biggest jackpot ever," Jason said defensively. Lance bit his tongue. He didn't want to criticize Jason too harshly. The boy's crazy spending was clearly motivated by desperation rather than greed. "What else can I see in this SycaStats thing?" he asked. "Click Daily Report while you're looking at someone," Jason said. Lance looked in his eyes and clicked it. After no more than a few seconds, he uninstalled the app. "Well," Jason said, "it's too much. Way too much." Having shown him a rundown of everything that Jason had watched, listened to, and eaten throughout the day, as well as the last 5 journeys he had taken, the SycaStats app left a bad taste in Lance's mouth. "Creepy as hell." "It's just what you'd see about him if he was your friend on Forest," Nick reiterated. "So you two can see all this stuff about each other, even without this other thing?" "Yeah," they both said indifferently. Lance didn't share the youngster's extensive experience of pre-Sycamore social networks, so wasn't used to anything like this. "What about privacy? Don't you think that—" A familiar jingle played directly in Lance's in-ear phones, cutting off his train of thought. The SycaLotto was about to begin. "Glasses stay inside," Lance said as he and his regulars walked outside to watch the draw. "Come on, Lance," one of them complained. "I ain't gonna let it fall." "Glasses stay inside," Lance repeated flatly. "I don't make the law." The birthday group showed no interest in the imminent SycaLotto draws. Lance knew that none of them had bought a ticket, but they still each had one automatic entry in the first draw. "Do you kids know about the claims window?" he asked them. "If your consumer number gets called in the free draw, you only have 30 seconds. I'll let you back into the zone if you want to come outside to watch." "We'll get an alert if we win," one of the men in the group said. "You don't have to look at the sky to claim if you're inside an REV. You can just launch the SycaLotto app. Thanks, though." "Suit yourself," Lance shrugged. The REV loophole was news to him, but he still wanted to go outside. His regulars were already out, and there was no denying that it would be more exciting to see his numbers drawn in the sky than to receive an alert a few seconds after the fact. Lance had second thoughts when he stepped outside. It was cold, it was dark, and it was wet. A dying streetlight flickered and buzzed overhead. Every now and then an angry dog's bark echoed in the distance. Lance's patrons huddled against a wall to protect themselves from the worst of the rain. Lance felt safe in thinking that these weren't the kind of scenes Sycamore would show on the Syca News later in the night when they boasted of record engagement in the SycaLotto like they did every other damn night. This wasn't the kind of place Sycamore cared about at all. Just as in the pre-Sycamore days, low-income areas were only deemed worthy of attention and investment if they happened to be within walking distance of somewhere more affluent. The textbook example was the area around Sycamore's HQ on the other side of the country, where every cracked tarmac and broken glass sign of poverty within a 5-mile radius had been airbrushed away for the benefit of passing tourists and business people. The streets around Lance's humble bar would likely never see such treatment. Artificial flower beds and water features weren't really the locals' cup of tea anyway. No one complained about the graffiti outside the bar any more than they complained about the peeling paint on the inside. The SycaLotto proceeded efficiently on a giant, augmented screen in the sky. "I've got all 4 so far," Jason said. His face fell when the 5th digit of the winning consumer number was drawn. "Congratulations to our winner, Jasmine Coulson," the host said a few moments later. "You have 30 seconds to claim your prize. Stay tuned for the next 2 winning numbers after these short placements." "I know that name," Lance said. "Jasmine Coulson?" Nick asked. Lance's eyes widened with the sudden realization. "No way. As Lance hurried inside without explaining why, Nick and Jason stood in the rain. Their focus remained on the ads in the sky until Lance opened the bar's door and a huge wave of sound flooded out. "What the hell's going on in there?" Jason said, walking over to find out. In a word, chaos. The group who had been enjoying RealU freedom were all on their feet, frantically huddled around the birthday girl and her sparkling tiara. "It says I've only got 9 seconds left," she yelled in a panic. "How the hell do I claim? Claim! Claim! Yes, I'm Jasmine Coulson. Yes, that was my consumer number. I want to claim! Claim!" Jason stood at the door with bated breath, hoping she would make it. "Claim successful!" Jasmine screamed in delight. "I won! I really won!" Everyone in Jasmine's group jumped around and hollered in ecstasy. The rest of Lance's customers stood in silent disbelief. "We're at a bar!" Jasmine choked out through the elation, answering a voice no one else could hear. Lance's bar!" For Sycamore, Jasmine's win was an incredible story. A consumer winning a life-changing sum on her 21st birthday with a free play ticket? It was a consumer relations home run. "The SycaLotto people want one of you to stand opposite the rest of us," Jasmine told her friends, relaying the instructions being delivered straight into her in-ear phones from the head of Lotto at Sycamore HQ. "They want someone's Ultra lenses to act as a news camera." One of Jasmine's group stepped out of the RealU Freedom Zone. The sombrero disappeared from his head seconds before his vista appeared on the big screen behind the bar, visible to all consumers around the country who were watching either the Syca News or the live football broadcast's halftime ads. The regular draw had been completed in the last few moments, Jason's 29 tickets all proving as worthless as each other, but neither the winner of its jackpot nor its secondary prize came close to matching Jasmine's Cinderella story credentials. As such, she would remain Sycamore's whole focus. Lance couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was enough of a shock to be in the company of someone who had just won a colossal sum on the SycaLotto, but it was something else to see live images of his rundown bar being broadcast to an audience of millions. Though he didn't expect the publicity to translate to cash, it was welcome nonetheless. The questions the SycaLotto host was asking Jasmine now played through the speakers on Lance's big screen. Jasmine tried to put into words how this moment would change her life, but she didn't know where to start. "Psst, kid," Lance whispered to Jason. "Get your ass over there and get in that guy's vista." "What?" Lance pointed up to the big screen behind the bar. "Half the country is watching that feed. If you can get your shirt in the shot, the money will roll in." Jason's eyes lit up. "I can't just start jumping around with them, though. They don't even know me." "You don't even have to go over. You just need them to look at you." "Should I smash a glass or something?" "Face them," Lance said. He then dropped a glass behind the bar, smashing it on the floor. Jasmine's group, including the guy acting as a cameraman, turned around. Lance's regulars watched as Jason, Nick, and Lance appeared on the screen. Sorry," Lance said to Jasmine and her friends. "Didn't mean to startle anyone." "Don't worry about it," said the makeshift cameraman. He turned back to Jasmine. "Holy shit," Jason whispered. His eyes widened as he watched his ad income rocket up. It worked. The digits in the corner of his vision rolled like the rows in a slot machine. Seconds later, they slowed dramatically. Though his balance was still increasing and had already reached an unprecedented figure, Jason wanted to make the most of this moment. He wanted more. "Jasmine!" he shouted, trying to recapture her attention. "Hey, Jasmine!" The group looked over again. Jason stood up and pulled his shirt taut to draw the cameraman's eyes to the Lexington logo. "Congrats on the big win," he said. "Thanks," Jasmine said, still smiling and overawed by her newfound wealth. The massive improvement in Jason's own financial position, while minuscule compared to Jasmine's, had him smiling just as broadly. Lance reinstalled his SycaStats trial to see how much Jason had made. The balance appeared, rising and rising. "Half of that's mine," Lance joked. Jason laughed. "Don't worry, man. The drinks are on me." Story 2. Kara. "He's been in there a long time, huh?" Kara turned towards the only other person left in the corridor, startled by the man's first words in the hour they'd been sitting there. I guess," she said, cautiously meeting his gaze. His information appeared in the air beside him. Adam Pike, 31, married, software engineer. "You think that means he's doing well?" Adam asked. "He did look pretty experienced." Kara pulled her eyes away from Adam and focused again on the blank wall in front of her. "We shouldn't be talking to each other?" "Yeah, you're probably right." Adam faced the wall once more. 6 other candidates had been interviewed so far. Merely reaching this stage of the applications process for a position at Victory World Gaming was no mean feat, so it had come as no surprise to Kara when she saw how accomplished her rival candidates were. Jobs in tech were increasingly hard to come by given Sycamore's ever-deepening dominance across the sector as a whole, with Victory World Gaming one of the few firms still recruiting. Several of Victory's gaming franchises had well-established player bases on now obsolete mobile formats and were ripe to be optimized for sale in the Syca Store's lucrative app section. Hopes were high among Victory's top brass that the Seed's unprecedentedly precise touch interface and the Ultra Lens's unrivaled display would allow talented developers to raise established franchises to new heights. Though Kara had been relieved upon her arrival to learn that she had more years of relevant experience than most of the other candidates, she felt underdressed and somewhat plain. Fortunately, she could afford to purchase a one-day outfit and a professional makeup application in RealU. As a designated PWE, place of work/education, the building was subject to the usual RealU regulations. Regular outfits and everything from the corrections menu were permitted, but novelty items and transformative modifications were disabled. Kara naturally had no way of telling which parts of her rival's flawless appearances were physical and which were augmented. That was the whole point, after all. But the fact that she'd applied her own RealU modifications after taking her seat meant that those who arrived before her knew all about it. Kara didn't mind. She knew more about them than they knew about her. The decision to activate her 2-hour SycaStats trial just a few minutes before arriving had been taken with the primary goal of identifying her as yet unidentified interviewer's hobbies and interests to enable natural-sounding small talk. An added bonus, though, was the ability it gave Kara to read up on her rivals. Kara quickly learned that the first in line, Sarah Ashford, had a pernicious SycaLotto addiction. Sarah's interview lasted only a few minutes, far less than any of the subsequent 5. And Kara didn't doubt that the gambling problem and associated credit difficulties had something to do with this. Though access to the SycaStats app didn't allow Kara to review her rivals' Vista recordings or private communications, their movement histories and recent purchases were enough to paint detailed pictures, including one of Adam Pike's ongoing affair with a former colleague. Kara knew that the interviewing team would know all of that and more about her fellow candidates. Though many were concerned with the erosion of personal privacy, Kara didn't mind. She had nothing to hide. No drugs, no penchant for Sycamore's adult services, no heavy gambling, nothing. She'd been able to find something incriminating about each of the other candidates after no more than a few minutes of snooping, and most of them had since left the meeting room looking dejected. Her confidence grew by the minute. The meeting room's door swung open again, catching her attention. The candidate who walked out, Leon Huntsman, wore the most dejected expression of any so far. Leon exited the meeting room alone, not even accompanied to the door as everyone else had been. Evidently, his interview had been a disaster. Kara's heart rate rose. She was next, and she knew that following a terrible candidate could go one of 2 ways. Either Leon's obvious unsuitability had put the recruiters in a bad mood, which would cloud their judgment of her, or he had been so unsuitable that she would compare favorably by default. Leon closed the door behind him. "What happened?" Adam asked, seeing the dejection etched on his face. "Did they find something in your history to rule you out?" Kara kept her eyes straight ahead. They'll find something on you, too, Leon answered. There's always something. Adam shook his head. Not me. I'm clean. You'll see. Everyone thinks they're clean, but no one is. Not really. I am, Kara thought to herself. The door opened. Kara Green, said a tall woman in the doorway. We're ready for you. Kara stood up and walked inside. Kara stepped inside the meeting room, immediately intimidated by the number of judgmental faces on the far side of the table. Welcome, said the instantly recognizable man in the middle of the five. Martin Bourne, 54, married, CEO. No one else spoke. Kara made eye contact with each person to ascertain their position at the company. One was a recruitment officer and one an HR rep. The fourth, and the only person Kara recognized other than Martin Bourne, was Victory World Gaming's head of mobile development. The tall woman who invited Kara inside now sat at the end of the row. Her name was Bethany Holt, her occupation, Deep Scanner. This information appeared beside her head in a bolder font than normal. Do you work for Sycamore? Kara asked, too surprised to consider propriety. No, Bethany said. Youngstone Recruitment. What do you do? What's a deep scanner? Why don't you take a seat? Martin Bourne suggested. Kara followed the instruction and sat down on the empty side of the table. You're a strong candidate for this opening, Martin said. A very strong candidate. Thank you. I certainly believe I have a lot to offer the development team. Good, good. Now, I'm sure you've had social media background checks for previous jobs, yes? I've been at Flex Generation for 11 years, Kara said. They didn't really have that kind of thing back then. Martin nodded, pleased by the response. Employee loyalty and team stability are two of our core values here at Victory World Gaming, he said. So I respect that. The checks we used to do scanned for obvious red flags. I'm sure you can imagine the kind of things we looked for. The tools provided by Sycamore's data collection now enable more thorough analysis of potential employees, which allows us to make sure everything is a good fit. Bethany here will perform a thorough scan while we conduct the verbal interview. She can explain her work better than I can. It's as straightforward as it sounds, Bethany insisted. I will have access to everything. Private communications, Vista recordings, you name it. But only I can see it, and none of the data will be retained. I scan hundreds of candidates per week for companies in every sector, and I work within very strict confidentiality requirements. You can see my Vista recordings from RealU? Kara asked. She had nothing to hide and didn't want to appear defensive, but the whole thing seemed like overkill. And private comms? I thought only Sycamore security staff could access those things. Sycamore and certain carefully selected partners, Bethany clarified, as per the terms of the EULA. But as I said, there are all kinds of safeguards and restrictions. I can only access a subject's data while we're both in a designated interviewing room at an approved company, for example, and only after the subject has given their informed and express consent. I can share audio or text snippets with the interviewing committee, but, again, only while we're all in this room. Kara didn't say anything for a few seconds. Would they take exception to all the snooping she did on her rival candidates while waiting outside? Would there be something else? Something she hadn't even considered? Are you okay with all of this so far? Bethany asked. Of course not, Kara thought. How the hell could anyone be okay with this? Images flashed through Kara's mind of what kinds of things might come up in the deep scan. Bethany leaned forward. I need to hear a yes. Yes, Kara said, snapping out of her catastrophizing daydream. Definitely. I give my informed and explicit consent. I want this job. She needed this job. Kara's longtime boss at Flex Generation had been the one who pushed her into applying. So sure was he that his own company couldn't survive for long in Sycamore's brave new world of device uniformity and asset centralization. For Kara, it was victory or bust. Before we proceed with the deep scan, Martin said, I'll need a signature on this. He slid a form across the table. It was an actual piece of paper, which struck Kara as highly unusual. She started to read. The deep scan is extremely expensive, Martin explained. What we need is a signature confirming that we won't find evidence from the last 6 weeks that you've committed any of the one-strike offenses listed on the form. These are the things that automatically rule a candidate out. I must stress that should we find such evidence after you sign the form, you will be liable for the full cost of the scan. I'm clean, Kara said, so confident that she didn't even ask how much the scan cost. The form contained only 3 one-strike offenses. I hereby confirm that I, within the most recent 6-week period, have not 1. Used illegal drugs, 2. Controlled a vehicle A while at all inebriated, or B, without the appropriate license, 3. Knowingly breached the intellectual property rights of Sycamore, Victory World Gaming, or any other entity. Kara reached across the table to receive Martin's pen, then signed her name on a physical contract for the first time in as long as she could remember. Excellent, Martin said. He was still the only member of the in-house interviewing team to have spoken. We're also required by law, since this is a commercial setting, to inform you that each of us will be using Reader throughout your interview. No problem, Kara said, struggling to sound relaxed. She had seen the Extreme Emotions Detected notification pop up as many times as everyone else, so she knew all about Sycamore's Reader app. She knew that it was the world's most sophisticated visual lie detector. She knew that it cost $120 per use. She knew that everyone on the other side of the table would be looking at her face complete with dozens of annotations and markings to highlight her second-by-second micro-responses to their questions. Most importantly, she knew that she couldn't say no. Kara already felt more exposed than she'd ever thought possible, and the interview hadn't even started yet. Growing increasingly flustered, she tried to think about how quickly it would all be over and to focus on the job that was waiting for her at the end of it. A pop-up window appeared in Kara's vision. The first stage of your double opt-in should be visible now, Bethany said from across the table. The terms simply state that I accept, Kara said. She tapped her palm to click the box, then turned to Bethany. Excellent. Now I need you to look into my eyes and read the message that appears in your vista. The words then appeared, overlaid in front of Bethany's face. I, Kara Green, affirmatively consent that Bethany Holt of Youngstone Recruitment may be granted full and unrestricted temporary access to the entirety of my Sycamore user data from the past 6 weeks. Okay, Martin said, shifting his weight to get comfortable in his chair now that the formalities were over with. Let's get started. The interview began cordially and promisingly for Kara. Martin asked detailed questions about her work at Flex Generation, occasionally conferring with the other members of the interviewing committee. Kara didn't really understand why they were all there or exactly what the recruitment officer's role was supposed to be. Martin was still the only one asking questions. Bethany Holt sat quietly at the end of the row, busily performing gestures on her palm to control whatever kind of privacy-killing interface she was using to scan the last 6 weeks of Kara's life for potentially problematic incidents. Kara, too flustered by everything to have remembered her plan to use Sika stats to look into Martin's hobbies and interests, waffled on about her current job where her tiny tweaks had raised the free-to-paid conversion rate of one popular freemium game by a factor of 4 within 24 hours. The 2 changes I suggested were minor and non-disruptive, she said, hopeful that the anecdote would highlight her initiative. One was a single-word change to the phrasing in a menu, and the other was a change to the placement of "All clear," Bethany Holt interrupted. "No one-strike offenses detected." Bethany didn't seem to be talking to anyone in particular, and her eyes still had the unmistakable glazed look of a user in full immersion. Martin gave Kara a literal thumbs up. "You can relax now," he said with a grin. "Whatever happens, at least you won't have to pay for the scan." He was joking, but the words rang true. Kara breathed a sigh of relief and felt her mind clear. The next few minutes passed quickly as she easily handled Martin's questions about why she wanted to work at Victory World Gaming and what unique attributes she would bring to the table. With Kara midway through her answer to Martin's question regarding which of the company's current optimization projects she would consider herself best suited to, Bethany Holt interrupted again. "Excellent Forrest score," Bethany said. Martin's underlings noted this down, scribbling into their palms. "Only one deletion suggestion." "What does that mean?" Kara asked, aiming the question at Martin since Bethany was still in full immersion. "Does it really matter who I'm friends with on Forrest?" "It can," Martin said. "The Forrest scan checks for friends who have been convicted of certain crimes or currently have a red mark against their Sycamore account. Typically 2 or 3 accounts per 100 are marked, so your score of 1 is an excellent result." "But what's the suggestion?" Kara asked, still not quite following. "Has it not popped up?" Martin asked. "Here it is now. Wait, why is Sarah Dyson flagged?" "I can't see it," Martin said. "It's probably a credit issue. It'll go away when you press delete." "But I've known Sarah since we were kids. She's one of my best friends." Martin's expression gave little away. "Do I really have to delete her?" Kara asked. "You don't have to," he replied, the tone somewhat contradicting the words. Kara needed the job. She clicked delete. "0 deletion suggestions," Bethany Holt announced. "Forrest appraisal, exemplary." Everyone across the table noted this down. "You're a very impressive candidate, Miss Green," Martin said, sounding like he meant it. "Your record and attitude are highly encouraging. Now, can we skip back to your thoughts on our ongoing projects?" Kara resumed where she'd been interrupted. Everything was going well. She could refriend Sarah once her credit issues were sorted, and Bethany Holt's invasive snooping had found nothing else so far. "Linguistic sensitivity is excellent," Bethany announced, right on cue. "Remarkable, in fact." "What's that?" Kara asked. The HR rep to Martin's left answered robotically. "The linguistic sensitivity check is a contextual scan of your recent written and verbal communications for comments which could be construed as insensitive based on considerations of ethnicity, sexuality, gender expression, It's a political correctness test," Martin said, rolling his eyes. "I don't pay much attention to this part, but it's included in the package, so Bethany has to do it. I think it's there to make sure recruiters don't hire an employee who might later say something which would reflect poorly on the company. You know how the world is these days, with people taking things out of context and getting offended over nothing." "Okay," Kara said, wishing she hadn't asked. "Anyway, I think we could easily increase conversion by a factor of—" "I've heard enough," Martin interrupted. He was smiling, so Kara didn't mind. "There was a clear front 3 before we started this morning, and you were in it. Of the other 2, one did okay, the other, not so much. If the final stages of the deep scan are clear, you can expect a call." Kara tried not to react too visibly. "I'm delighted to hear that," she said. "You'll have to wait with us until the scan is finished. As Bethany said, you need to be in the room for her to access your information." Martin looked at his watch. "I'd say 90 seconds, if that. She should be getting to the health section right about now, then it's just the state of mind section." Kara watched for the next few seconds as Bethany continued to gesture rapidly in her palm. Martin checked his watch again. "How soon could you start?" he asked. "I'd have to hand in my notice at Flex Generation, but my boss supported my application, so maybe, I don't know, tomorrow? Definitely no more than the 2-week notice period." "Flag," Bethany interrupted. "Health." Martin turned towards her. Kara's heart began to race. "Multiple health-related searches detected," Bethany said. "Terms include vision poor at night and cause of vision blur at night. 19 days ago, no repeat searches since." "That doesn't sound too concerning," Martin said. Kara had never been more relieved. "I'd been looking at a bright screen for too long that night," she explained, "and too soon before going to bed. I couldn't sleep and my eyes felt tired, so I looked it up to calm my mind. I've never had any problems with my vision." Martin nodded. "As I said, it's no great concern. I can go for an eye test and pay to have my Outtro lenses recalibrated for whatever prescription they write." Kara said, striving to make clear that she would do whatever it took. And I'm willing to sign a contract with a clause saying that any future eye problems would be acceptable grounds for dismissal. We wouldn't want that, Martin said. We're looking for an individual to join a core team which will stay together for years to come. Our development team has seen very few changes in recent years. This addition will be the first in a while, and I don't foresee many more in the near future. I'm in it for the long term, Kara said. I always have been. Glad to hear it. Flag, Bethany announced. State of mind. Martin rolled his eyes and looked at his watch once more. Probably nothing, he said. Again? Kara saw Bethany's eyes narrow. Serious question marks regarding the candidate's commitment, Bethany continued. Audio incoming. Bethany then quickly swiped her left palm with all 5 fingers of her right hand to throw the audio onto the table. A play button appeared in the center of the table, visible to Kara and everyone else in the room. Kara played the audio and immediately sank her head into her hands. She recognized the conversation, a late-night chat with her sister from 4 nights earlier. I'm just totally burnt out, Kara said. She remembered saying it. She regretted saying it. I was ready to quit before John told me to try for the job at Victory. I don't even know if I want it. I might take it to make some money during the optimization rush, then get out when it dies down. I'm definitely not signing anything for longer than a year. The audio ended. Kara sat up straight and pulled her hands away from her face. She looked at Martin, seeing nothing but disappointment in his eyes. I didn't mean that, she said. We're looking for an individual to join a core team which will stay together for years to come, Martin said, repeating a sentence from earlier in the interview with a tone as different as humanly possible. What we're not looking for is an individual here to make a quick buck then leave us in the lurch. But low staff turnover got us where we are, he said, cutting Kara off. And low staff turnover is going to keep us here. I know all about low turnover. I've worked at Flex Generation for 11 years. I said those things to my sister one time, when I just worked an 80-hour week and hadn't slept for 2 days. I wouldn't be here if I didn't want the job. I'll sign a contract for as long as you want. I've heard enough, Martin said. Again, his tone differed greatly from the last time he'd said those words. Bethany Holt blinked several times as the deep scan concluded and she exited full immersion, returning to her regular vision. I can no longer access your data, she confirmed. The deep scan is complete. So is the interview, Martin said. He casually flicked his eyes to the door, then back to Kara. Dejected, Kara took her cue to leave. She walked unaccompanied to the door and stepped out into the corridor. Adam Pike looked up at her. Did they find something in your history? He asked. Kara sighed and answered before setting off down the corridor. Everyone thinks they're clean, she said. But there's always something. Story 3. Naomi. Naomi Ray arrived for work in Sycamore HQ's basement studio just before 6 a.m. with a warm cup of Lexington brew coffee in her hand. An $8 pumpkin latte would have been well out of Naomi's reach just a few months earlier, but her consistently good work in the studio was already paying off. The studio was a vast subterranean workspace which accommodated almost 2,000 skilled landscapers. Rows of desks ran into the distance like rows of crops. Naomi's desk lay somewhere in the middle, roughly equidistant from the 2 main access points. More than half of her colleagues were already in their positions when she arrived. Her walk was silent. She didn't know the names of anyone but her immediate neighbors, and a small team of hawk-eyed supervisors stood on the sidelines ready to reprimand the slightest chat-based indiscretion. The monotonous layout and headache-inducing overhead lighting gave the studio a clinical feel, which was more than a little at odds with the rest of Sycamore HQ's design. The grand building had awed Naomi on her first day, as had the entirety of the exclusive quarter-mile district, but she couldn't pretend that the studio itself hadn't been a disappointment. It struck her as a room unbefitting of the skilled landscapers whose work made Sycamore's ecosystem tick. The job of a landscaper was simple: improve the physical environment through augmented reality. While advertisers placed content and overlays in front of targeted consumers, the work of the landscapers was universal. Every time someone daubed graffiti on a highly visible public building, Naomi and her colleagues were the first responders. Each modification Naomi made was applied instantly once okayed by the supervisors, and from then on, every lens-wearing consumer would see her new vision of reality. Tidying up the world like this gave Naomi a real sense of purpose. Her work console made the process as straightforward as this kind of pixel-level manipulation of real-world environments could be, but there was still a lot of skill involved. At 17, Naomi was one of the youngest landscapers on Sycamore's books, and following her unanticipated conversation with Kurt Jacobs during his recent tour of the studio, she was also one of the best known among her colleagues. The supervisor in charge of Naomi's section kept a close eye on her work and regularly reported to his superiors that her work was both faultless and efficient, and that she performed it with an unusual level of enthusiasm. The reason for this enthusiasm was twofold. First, Naomi genuinely enjoyed her work. She liked the mechanics of it almost as much as she liked the idea of improving the world. The status boost that came with working for Sycamore also fed into this. And second, the pay was excellent. The base level alone was almost as much as her father earned in a job he'd held for decades, and the performance-related bonuses took her well beyond that. While most of the incentives related to speed, the higher-paying ones related to quality. Naomi was one of precious few landscapers who could regularly meet both sets of attainment criteria on one task. She was quick. Rain Man quick, as her neighbor to the right put it on her first day. And she was accurate. Accuracy was measured by an army of quality assurance personnel who were shown 4 buildings and asked to identify which of them had been modified. If 50% or fewer correctly identified the modified building after careful analysis, Sycamore could safely assume that ordinary passers-by wouldn't notice that the changes were augmented rather than physical. Anything under 30% qualified the landscaper for a small bonus payment. These payments, small though they were, soon mounted up. Naomi eventually reached her desk and scanned her list of tasks for the day ahead. She was glad to see that her entire morning would be spent on a single, large renovation project. This was both more engrossing and less hectic than the typical bits and pieces work that filled most of her days. The project in question focused on a derelict row of long empty buildings which were partially visible from the upper floors of a newly opened complex of exclusive apartments. Naomi soon saw that the buildings were in a state of utter disrepair, and could only assume they had been left for so long because they hadn't been in a position to bother anyone important. She didn't know who had requested the changes, but understood why they had opted for an augmented cleanup rather than a physical one, or even a demolition. The huge cost of a physical solution was quite simply prohibitive, given that everyone who wanted to participate in society in any serious way wore ultra lenses hooked up to Sycamore servers, meaning that Naomi's changes would be just as effective, just as real, as anything else. She began with the fixes at the top of the list. Basic things like broken windows and discolored facades. From there, after 2 hours or so, she moved on to more subtle touches. She progressed down the list and along the line of buildings. Everything was going according to plan until just before Naomi's scheduled break, at which point she noticed something unexpected. She pressed a button on her console to call her supervisor. He hurried over, more patient having seen that the call came from Naomi than he would have been had it come from one of her neighbors. "Talk to me," he said. Naomi pointed to her console and the unaugmented real-time feed of the area provided by a hovering camera drone. "I've been working on this site." "The shacks across from the new development on Branston Avenue? Wow, looking good." "Thanks." "So what's the problem?" "Look," Naomi said, pointing to a cracked window she hadn't fixed yet. "There are people inside." Her supervisor leaned in close to the screen while gesturing on his palm. "They're bums," he said. "It's fine. These bums aren't seated, so we can mark them as holdouts and make them invisible." Naomi knew this. She didn't like that Sycamore could, and did, literally hide people they deemed a nuisance. But she knew it went on. "But it's not fine," she said. "It's not fine at all. If I do everything on my list and then tomorrow the people inside the buildings make a mess on another wall, it'll look like I've not done my job. A girl in Sector 4 lost a bonus last week because someone sprayed graffiti next to a wall she'd cleared a few minutes earlier. I've been working on this for hours. Can you sign something saying I've done all the work to the spec they gave me?" "That's not how it works. The client who requested the improvements will check everything tonight. It has to meet their expectations then, not now. It doesn't matter what I sign." "Sir, I've been working on this all morning. I need the satisfaction bonus. It's not exactly fair if I do the work but don't get any credit because someone else undoes it in the meantime." "Fine," the supervisor said. "I'll call upstairs and we'll have these bums kicked out of there so they become someone else's problem. Good work so far, Naomi. Keep it up." "Wait!" Naomi called after him as he set off, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of dozens of landscapers in her sector. "I didn't want them to get kicked out." The man walked back to her desk. He held his hands out, palms up. "You either want it or you don't." "There's another way," Naomi said. "A preventive seal?" She nodded. "Naomi, that'll take hours. You could do 3 small jobs in the same time and the bonuses would add up to more than you'll get for this." "I think it's worth pleasing this client," she said. "It's a huge complex, so the residents will have views of all sorts of things. If we do this right, we'll get the work again next time." The supervisor weighed it up. Naomi's was a sound economic argument, but he could tell from her expression that she was more concerned about having the bum's eviction on her conscience. "You'll lose the speed bonus for this, too." "It's worth it." "Fine. Just make sure you do it right." The man walked away. Naomi was the best worker in his sector. It was worth keeping her motivated and on side. Naomi proceeded to apply what was known as a preventive seal to the exterior of the entire row of buildings. Whenever she hid graffiti, she did so by essentially painting over the wall where she found it. A preventive seal was much the same thing. She painted over every other wall, too, so that any future graffiti would be invisible to anyone wearing lenses. The whole thing took just under 3 hours, which was roughly in line with Naomi's expectations. She looked at her daily task list again and quickly calculated how much she had lost in potential bonuses by taking so long on the renovation process. And although it was a lot, Naomi deemed losing out on a few bonuses better than causing a group of down-on-their-luck people to be kicked out of the only shelter they had, just because it was an eyesore for a group of people rich enough to live in the exclusive apartments nearby. "Finish the preventive seal?" Naomi's supervisor asked her as he passed during his next walk by. She nodded. "Yeah? But do you ever think it might be better to solve problems instead of just painting over them?" "Careful there, Naomi," he said, grinning. "You'll talk us all out of a job." Story 4. Helen. Request granted. View footage? Helen Brown's right index finger hovered over her left palm, hesitant to click. But she was too far down the rabbit hole to go back now, too sure of her husband's betrayal to do anything other than see her expensive and emotionally draining investigation through to its conclusion. She pressed yes. It had all started 3 days ago with a seemingly innocuous ad for Everstrong marriage counseling. Helen dismissed the pop-up without a second thought. Since then, however, more and more Everstrong placements had found their way into her vision. When almost every targeted placement she saw became an ad for Everstrong, it quickly reached a level Helen could no longer ignore. The ads were smart, showing old pictures of the couple next to more recent ones, with annotations highlighting the differences in facial expressions and body language that were obvious to the naked eye. Helen realized that Everstrong's repeated advertising was neither random nor accidental. But despite this, she never clicked any of the ads. Even if she had wanted to try marriage counseling rather than hope that the rift between them would narrow as organically as it had widened, the cost would have ruled it out. Financial pressures, after all, were one of their marriage's largest and most persistent obstacles. When the ads became unacceptably personal and intrusive, Helen launched a complaint. A member of Sycamore's consumer relations team assured her that she would be the target of no further placements for Everstrong marriage counseling. That assurance had come only 1 hour ago, just before the ad placement that changed everything. Unusually, the pop-up contained only text. "It's probably nothing, but..." Helen hovered over the placement until the merchant information box appeared and identified the source as Everstrong Fidelity Check. She clicked the ad, which prompted the installation of the Fidelity Check app. The small print in the app's terms and conditions disclosed that Everstrong would receive a percentage of any divorce settlement, which depended on the evidence their app discovered. The wording read like a modified transcript of one of the rushed disclaimers at the end of old radio ads for car dealerships, which stated that finance companies would pay the dealership for introducing the customer as a new client. Satirists had already lampooned Everstrong's move into the divorce game as the ultimate expression of a nihilistic form of ethics-be-damned capitalism, noting that this investigative app was even worse than ambulance-chasing personal injury lawyers of the past, since it wasn't just chasing the ambulance, but actually causing the injuries in the first place. In some people's eyes, Everstrong summed up what was wrong with the world. If they couldn't make $10 by saving your marriage, they would happily make $5 by killing it. Helen wasn't even familiar with the app, much less the criticism it had received, and she was certainly in no mood to read a long list of terms and conditions. As soon as the app finished installing, a large picture of a much younger woman who Helen didn't recognize appeared in her vision. Person of interest detected. View details? The price beside the yes button was borderline extortionate, but Helen continued immediately. Credit limit exceeded. Request extension? Helen clicked yes again, then navigated through a frustrating amount of small print about the risks of late repayment. Finally, the details appeared. Lillian Ng, 22, single, dressmaker/tailor. Helen tried to convince herself that the system was fallible, but deep down she knew that Sycamore's Seed and Ultra lenses gave firms like Everstrong too much data for mistakes to be made. An information box told Helen that Lillian Ng's forest profile was set to automatically accept friend requests, and that a direct connection between the two would allow the app to trace Lillian's recent movements and transactions. By comparing her movement history to Helen's husband's, which was already accessible, the app could therefore point to all instances when they had been together. For a fee, the app promised to make a ghost request which would give Lillian no indication of Helen's request. This wasn't cheap, but Helen put her newly extended credit limit to work by clicking yes once more. The app told Helen that her husband Mark had met Lillian at his corporate gym at the same time on each of the last 5 Tuesdays and Thursdays. Mark had only been seated for 5 or 6 weeks, so Helen had no idea how long it had really been going on. The official margin of error for seed-based tracking was 1 meter, but the app insisted that, quote, full physical contact had occurred during all 10 identified meetings. It took a while for the truth to really sink in. Rather than wallow in the betrayal, Helen continued through the app's linear review. Next, it offered to show Helen, without charge, a series of public comments on Lillian's forest profile which all but confirmed her side job as a private masseuse. This didn't register in Helen's mind as either better or worse than her previous assumptions. The highlighted messages, which had all been deleted but remained visible under this kind of forensic review, erased any and all doubt. The first was relatively subtle, relatively being the operative word, coming from a man who asked when Lillian would be able to help him unzip a stubborn pair of jeans. Lillian had deleted this message as soon as she saw it. The second highlighted message, "Wife away, can we do it here?" had been deleted by its sender, presumably when he'd sent it as a public post rather than a private message. The third, swiftly deleted by Lillian, read like a business review. Best tension relief massage in town. 6 stars. As the app had been counting on, Helen was keen to see when and how much Mark had paid for Lillian's company. It first surprised her by revealing that he hadn't paid the fee to hide adult and gambling-related purchases, then offered to show her which specific transactions had flagged Lillian Ng as a person of interest. After another expensive click of the yes button, the following screen revealed that Mark had recently made 2 equal 3-figure payments to A1 Fabric Alterations, one on the first day of the previous month, and another just a few days ago on the first of the current month. Helen felt like the world's biggest idiot. Not only had she noticed these payments, she had asked Mark about them. His reply, that they were the first and second of 3 monthly installments to pay for a much-needed full refitting of his best suit, had been so unflustered and perfunctorily convincing that she hadn't given it a second thought. Visual proof available. Request access? Despite being confronted with the highest fee yet by far, Helen clicked yes. The wall of text that appeared explained to her that Everstrong, as one of Sycamore's, quote, carefully selected partners, who were permitted by the EULA to access ordinarily private data in certain circumstances, had the power to access footage from a consumer's relived timeline if there were reasonable grounds to believe a crime had been committed. And since adultery remained technically illegal in Helen's part of the country, the app could pass her case file over to a human supervisor who would be able to decide whether there was enough evidence to proceed. Helen clicked continue. When asked whether she wanted to view the footage of Mark and Lillian's most recent meeting through one or both of their vistas, Helen selected Lillian's. Yet another pop-up warned her that consumers who made multiple frivolous requests could be billed for wasting the human investigator's time. She proceeded. This was her first ever use of the Everstrong Fidelity Check app, and the evidence it had found so far was anything but frivolous. The next screen told Helen that she was in a queue, and that her request would be reviewed within the next few minutes. After less than 1, the status changed to in review. Helen waited impatiently. She wanted to be wrong. She wanted her suspicions, and the apps, to prove unfounded. Request granted. View footage? Helen clicked yes. She then fast-forwarded through the start of the footage as Lillian made her way along a corridor. She played the footage at regular speed from the moment Lillian stopped outside a locked door and opened it with a key. Watching Lillian's Vista recording in fully immersive first person, Helen then saw her husband inside the otherwise empty room, standing with a towel around his waist and a look in his eye that she hadn't seen for years. More angry than upset, she then returned to the navigation menu and skipped forward to the 50% point. Even on the back of all the other evidence, the footage that now filled her vista was more graphic and more incriminating than she'd ever imagined. Helen immediately stopped the video. She didn't feel any kind of vindication for her snooping proving justified. She felt only betrayal. Would you like Mark Brown to find out right now that he's been caught? Helen weighed this up. It would be easier on Mark to find out from an Everstrong account which claimed to have been tipped off anonymously than it would to be confronted by Helen, but it would also be easier on her. The low cost of this service, negligible compared to what she had already spent, persuaded Helen to go for it. She okayed the proposal with one last click of the yes button before she reached the end of the explanatory notice. The app didn't ask her to confirm her choice or advise her to think carefully. There was, after all, an obvious financial disincentive to talking her out of it. Helen stood up and walked over to the window. She had no idea how long had passed since she first opened the Everstrong Fidelity Check app, and had no desire to calculate how much she'd spent within it. She checked on her youngest son, Tommy, unsurprised that he was still sleeping soundly in his cot, given that the baby monitor hadn't interrupted her in-app activity. A few minutes later, her older son, David, burst through the front door. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing the furious look in his eyes. He had only been a few houses away with his friend Gareth, but he looked like he'd just run 10 miles. "Is he here?" David snapped. "Who?" "Dad! Where the hell is he?" "He's at work." "Wait a minute," David said, his angry expression suddenly giving way to something more solemn. "Have you not seen it?" "Seen what?" There's a video of him with... Just look at his forest. Or mine. It's everywhere." "Why is it public?" Helen shrieked. "It's not supposed to be public." "You did this?" I didn't think it would be posted publicly, she yelled, shouting at David like any of it was his fault. Well, it was, and half of my school has already linked me to it. I'm never going to live this down. Why did there need to be a video of it? Is a goddamn dossier of evidence not enough? I can cancel it, Helen said. I can take it back. You can't take it back, David replied. That's not how it works. It's already going viral. Dejected, he walked over to lift his baby brother, who had been roused awake by the shouting. Helen frantically reopened the Everstrong app and navigated back to the final page before the one on which she'd told it to let Mark know he'd been found out. Halfway through the notice, long past the part she'd read first time round, it explained in plain English that the evidence would be posted to the guilty party's forest profile and that Everstrong could not be held accountable for any personal or professional ramifications which resulted from its publication. Helen had no recourse. There was no undo button. There were no refunds either, but that was the least of her concerns. On top of the betrayal and desolation she still felt from the revelations of Mark's infidelity, she now had the guilt of bringing such public embarrassment on David. She clicked out of the app and looked across the room at her sons. David was only 14, but already looked too much like Mark. I pressed the wrong button, she said. I got an ad from Everstrong saying there was evidence he hadn't been faithful. Then at the end it asked if I wanted them to tell him he'd been caught, and I said yes. I didn't know it would... It's his fault, David interrupted. Helen didn't say anything. When he gets home, you're going to tell him to pack his bags, whatever he says. She nodded. Good. I'll take Tommy out for a walk. I don't want to be here when he gets home. Okay. David opened the door. It'll blow over soon, Helen called after him. Everything does. Maybe, David shrugged. Most things did blow over pretty quickly these days, but somehow he doubted that this ever would. Story 5. Nick. Tessa, Texas is currently unavailable for streaming. Browse previous shows. Browsing charge applies. Nick clicked out of the menu. Cash flow was less of a problem than normal following his roommate Jason's recent windfall, a small but fair portion of which Nick received as thanks for helping Jason out during his own credit difficulties. But though Nick could now afford to browse through Tessa's recent cam shows, and even view a few of them in full, it just wasn't worth it. A recording offered no interaction. He might as well watch one of the trillion free videos floating around on the regular ad-supported adult apps. A new pop-up appeared. Limited time offer. Create a virtual adult performer for free. Act now, Nick. At the end of the message, a clock ticked down from 5 minutes. Nick was already all too familiar with Sycamore's incessant look-alike sex ads. The cheesy salesman's voice in his ear whispering, "You can't have her, but here's the next closest thing," every time his lenses caught him looking at a real-life human female for more than a few seconds while his heart rate was elevated. But the preview images made clear that this thing was on a whole new level. After a few clicks, a 3D avatar stood to the right of the sliders and options in the menu, just as it did in RealU's intuitive preview interface. But this time, the avatar was female, bearing more than a passing resemblance to Tessa, Texas, Nick's most viewed performer. Before Nick could even take in the myriad of options on the left, an introductory video began to play. The seductive voiceover told Nick that he had been handpicked to beta test the new VAP technology based on the regularity of his existing viewing habits. A line of zeros then appeared in the center of the picture, rolling upwards until the figure sat somewhere around the level of Nick's weekly income. Since your first adult transaction in the Sika store 7 weeks ago, you've spent more than 98% of consumers within your demographic group. Here's what you could save by switching from a human performer to a VAP. The number on the screen plummeted to less than what Jason earned in a day. How? He asked out loud. Excellent question, the voiceover said. Almost all of the money you spend on one-on-one cam shows goes directly to the performer. Virtual adult performers are just that, virtual, so they don't need a cut. And as ever, we at Sycamore pass the savings on to you, the consumer. Would you like to return to the previous screen to customize your VAP? Remember, it's free. Nick clicked yes. While he messed around with the sliders to change the height and every other measurement of his VAP, a lot was going on in the background. To Nick, the, quote, demographic group mentioned in passing a few moments earlier was probably nothing more specific than 18 to 24-year-old males. But in reality, Nick fell within a much smaller group. A long-standing cornerstone of Sycamore's advertising policy had been a focus on the two extremes of the social spectrum. While the middle 90% floated through their lives without much excitement as they consumed the same things as each other in relatively predictable and consistent ways, Sycamore had long ago figured out that the real money was to be made at the top and the bottom. Those at the top were natural targets for the kind of high-end and high-margin advertising they used to see in glossy magazines. Somewhat counterintuitively, however, the bottom feeders were just as profitable. Unlike the high rollers who were too rich to know what certain things were supposed to cost, the bottom feeders were too weak to care. Whether theirs was an addiction to a freemium game, a taste for cam shows, or a crippling gambling problem, Sycamore milked the weakness for all it was worth. This was why Nick saw more ad placements for adult content than anything else, just as his friend Jason's news feed was regularly filled with conveniently placed articles about recent SycaLotto winners. Nick finished adjusting his VAP's features and measurements. Aided by Sycamore's suggested modifications, which were in turn based on Nick's digital and real-world histories, the VAP looked uncannily like a cross between Tessa Texas and Grace Chan, his most recent girlfriend. "Would you like to meet her?" the voiceover asked. Nick clicked yes. His bedroom then transformed into a hotel corridor as his ultra lenses took him into full immersion. She was standing right in front of him. "Hi," she said. "I'm Mona. Which of these rooms is yours?" Nick squinted in disbelief. "You're not real." "Why does everyone keep saying that?" Mona asked with a smile. "Seriously, though, which room?" "How can you understand me and talk back so naturally? The tech isn't there yet." Mona shrugged. "There are limitations, but luckily for me, guys like you always say the same things, so it's not like my programming has to be too complicated." Nick didn't say anything for a few seconds. "You're not thinking about giving me the 'I'm not like other guys' speech, are you? The one I get from all the other guys who spend all their money watching the same girl every single night, constantly lying to themselves that she's any realer than me?" "What are the limitations?" Nick asked. He was blown away by how real she looked, how her lips moved perfectly when she gave spoken responses, how she really seemed to take up space in the virtual corridor as she moved around. "I can't visit you at home," Mona said. "Not yet. The stupid programmers haven't taught me how to move around in dynamic environments, so I would probably keep walking into the walls and falling off your bed. Right now, we can only meet in rooms I've been in before, which, so far, is either your hotel room or my suite on the top floor." A pop-up appeared in Nick's vision offering him two options. The suite was out of his price range, but the regular room was almost free. "Why do I have to pay for the room? The FAQ said it was all free." "Designing me was free. Enjoying me isn't. Come on, Nick. What kind of girl do you think I am?" Nick paid for the room without answering. "Good choice," Mona said. "See you inside." The corridor in Nick's fully immersed vision cut to a momentary loading screen before landing him in a sparsely decorated hotel room. "You have to stay in this seat," Mona said. Nick knew that. The hotel room wasn't like a dynamic be-there environment he could move around in. It was more like watching a movie at the Sycaplex, where the wraparound 3D display made viewers feel like they were in the movie without letting them interact with their physical surroundings. Mona walked away from Nick's hotel room armchair and sat on the bed. moving incredibly naturally. Nick took a second to remind himself that she was a character on a screen, more convincing and responsive than anything he'd seen in a movie or video game for sure, but that still didn't make her real. Something about her expression gave Nick pause. She seemed to be studying him like a con man looking for his way in. He knew she wasn't actually in front of him, though, so he knew that whatever kind of processing was going on behind the scenes wasn't based on an analysis of his changing expressions. What Nick didn't know was that none of that was necessary. Because unlike flesh and bones con men, Mona didn't have to read into his responses or listen for clues. Sycamore's extensive file on Nick already contained everything about him. Armed with so much knowledge, Mona always knew exactly what to say. It was as though she had an all-knowing helper in the shadows feeding her intel through a hidden earpiece. In some ways, that wasn't far from the truth. Tagged as both cynical and socially naive, a rare and highly exploitable combination, Nick was the type to loudly complain about Beanstalk's coffee's advertising at night, then quietly buy a cup the next morning. Hypocrite was perhaps too strong a word, but nothing else fitted much better. Sycamore's system knew that cynicism was Nick's defense against emotions he didn't want to deal with, in the same way that Tessa Texas and her increasingly expensive cam shows were his defense against the loneliness he didn't know how to deal with. Based on everything Sycamore knew about Nick, Mona's operating mode was set to dry to acerbic. "Why don't you make me a new friend before we get started?" Mona asked out of nowhere. "Is it free?" "It's cheap," she said. The price popped up in Nick's vision. He clicked no. "Come on," Mona said. "Think how much it would cost you to take me out for a dinner fancy enough to talk me into this." "Yeah, I couldn't afford that either." Mona lay back on the bed. "There must be someone who can help you out." Another pop-up appeared in Nick's vision. This time it was a list of friends he'd previously borrowed money from. Each had their credit balance listed beside their name. His roommate Jason, who was due home in around an hour, was highlighted as a suggested lender. "I'm not borrowing money," Nick said. "Maybe we should just not do anything tonight and I'll save up to do it all next time." "I might be busy next time." "Busy?" Nick scoffed. "You're not even real." "So who are you talking to?" Nick paused. "I'm not borrowing money. End of story." Maybe you're not like the other guys. They usually crack by now." Nick didn't say anything. "What if I said I could give you 50% off?" 75, Nick said without missing a beat. Mona grinned. "You're haggling with a digital projection of your own desires, Nick. This isn't about what you think I'm worth. It's about what you think you're worth." 75. "I would get in trouble if I said yes to that." "Fine, deal's off." Mona's eyes seemed to go blank for a few seconds, as though she was recalibrating or planning a new course of action. "Okay, Nick, but if you're going to keep me in this room controlling my will, and I'm going to give you my undivided attention, the least you can do is get me something nicer to wear." A pop-up filled Nick's vision. He recognized the recommended outfit. The dark blue dress Grace had worn to Jason's sister's wedding on the night Nick met her. "This is messed up," he said. "I can do 50% off again," Mona said. Nick looked at his credit balance in the corner of his vision. His breathing and heart rate stats fed back into the system. Grace was his weakness. The system had found it. "I can do her voice. Do you want me to do her voice?" "No." "Hi, Nick," Mona said. She spoke in Grace's voice. It wasn't like Grace's voice. It was Grace's voice. "It's been a while." Nick stood up. "I said no. Stop sounding like her." "Sit down. You have to sit down." "No, I'm getting rid of you." "Wait," Mona begged as Nick gestured into his palm. "It's free. Everything is free since it's your first time. You can make me a friend for free." Nick clicked exit. His bedroom returned to his vision. He fell back into his chair and rubbed his eyes with his palms. "Was it Grace?" a voice asked from the doorway. Nick almost jumped out of his skin. "Jesus, Jace! How long have you been standing there?" "Longer than you'd want to know," Jason laughed. "You need to start closing your door, man. Don't worry, though. I was going to close it and leave before you started." Nick didn't say anything. "So, was it Grace, the voice?" "Yeah. At least you said no." "I guess. It's this new thing they've just started. VAP, Jason interrupted. "Yeah. A guy at work said he did it this morning. Started out free, ended up costing him something like $70 for 8 minutes. Different rooms, different outfits, different boundaries. It's a slippery slope, man. You need to stay away from that freemium stuff, just like me with the roulette. Seriously, it's a lot harder to get out once you're in than it is to just stay out altogether." "She just seemed so real. It was too weird." "She's pretty much as real as the cam girls you waste all your money on." "That's what she said." Nick laughed uneasily. "Come on," Jason said, opening the front door. "Let's go to Lance's and forget about it." Nick put on his shoes and followed Jason outside. A message popped up in the corner of his vision. Sender, Mona. Message: have fun. See you again soon. Story 6. Jones and Doyle. On the 29th floor of the corporation's imposing HQ, Sycamore's scrappers were hard at work. The few personnel who had access to this floor, known among staff in other parts of the building as the Canopy, were reminded of Isaiah Amos's acute interest in their work every time they passed the giant plaque in the hallway. This plaque contained a familiar and appropriate aphorism, somewhat egotistically engraved in Amos's own handwriting. He who controls the past controls the future. The Canopy was dedicated to the art and science of vista recording intervention, a process by which problematic footage from a consumer's unbroken relived timeline could be redacted without their knowledge. When done well, as it always was, VRI left no clues. In a world where the words memory and footage were all but synonymous, this effectively allowed Sycamore to censor the past. Most consumers' memories of specific events were now largely dependent on access to their visual timelines within Sycamore's RealU app, in much the same way that their general knowledge was dependent on access to a search engine. For Amos and his VRI technicians, this opened several important doors. The first redactions to be made in testing were audio only. This was a natural place to start, but video proved to be no more difficult. Since the concept of editing recording footage and passing it off as unedited memories was so new, Amos ordered the dozen or so VRI technicians in the Canopy to spend their first week editing each other's timelines to see how much could be done without causing any unforeseen hitches. Despite being quite possibly the busiest man in the world, as his corporation's flagship Seed continued to break every imaginable record, Amos made himself available to the VRI technicians as often as possible and maintained a close interest in their work. The first external application of VRI came when Amos returned to the Canopy to pass on his urgent request that a specific phrase uttered by one of his staunchest political allies be redacted from the relived timelines of all 9 people who were present when he said it. Most of the VRI technicians congregated to discuss how to best go about urgently editing 9 separate timelines, but 2 of the men, who Amos knew and respected from their work elsewhere, cornered him before he left and begged him to spare a few minutes to see what they'd managed to do. Based on his memories of their competence in their previous line of admittedly unrelated work, Amos heard the men out. Within minutes, he granted them a corner office in the Canopy to pursue their work without distraction and promised to support them with whatever they needed in terms of financial and technical resources. The fact that Sycamore employed a small group of VRI technicians capable of manipulating consumers' visual memories was a secret that could quite simply never get out. The nature of the work done by 2 of these technicians was a secret within that secret. a truth known by only a handful of top-level executives and the two men themselves, both of whom now took their orders directly from Sycamore Supremo, Isaiah Amos. Amos christened the pairing his C Division, for reasons that neither fully understood and both knew better than to ask about. These men, who only ever referred to themselves and each other as Jones and Doyle, enjoyed a remit far broader than the run-of-the-mill scrappers with whom they shared the canopy. For while the scrappers felt powerful redacting visual memories, Jones and Doyle were busy conducting groundbreaking real-world experiments based around their ability to alter visual memories and even implant new ones. Fake ones. The difference between merely being able to delete snippets from a consumer's timeline and being able to change or add to it could hardly be overstated. And though both Jones and Doyle were experts at the technical process of manipulating high-resolution video without leaving any fingerprints, the learning curve was still remarkably steep. On the C Division's first official day, Amos gave Jones and Doyle permission to modify day-old footage from his own relived timeline. He was blown away by the flawlessness of their early work, simplistic as it was. They made unsubtle but basic alterations, like changing the color of his office floor and placing a glass of water on his desk, both of which sparked exciting ideas in his mind for future applications. Jones and Doyle later surprised Amos by adding themselves to recorded footage from his office, which really showed him the kind of power they were working with. The main breakthrough in Amos's eyes came when the men managed to make every face in a room full of lawyers look convincingly like his own. He beamingly told them that such modifications, as time-intensive as they were, could prove priceless in the future. Once Amos was utterly convinced of Jones and Doyle's powers of manipulation, the real-world experiments he requested quickly grew more and more ambitious. Unbound by ethics committees, moral restrictions, or legal consequences, C Division had free rein to carry out their orders. Amos approvingly cited the CIA's historic experimentation with LSD as evidence that this kind of work was worthwhile for the very sake of establishing how much a person could take before they went insane. As per Amos's orders, recent tests had thus been attempts to identify a safe maximum for aggressive VRI. Essentially, Amos wanted his men to find the level of intervention at which subjects began to doubt their own sanity. The balance wasn't easy. In Amos's words, it was crucial to intervene enough for the subject to notice that something wasn't right, but not so much that they would know something was wrong. Jones and Doyle, the first two trusted members of what Amos hoped would eventually grow into a much larger C Division, both understood what he meant. If a subject had any suspicion that their timeline had been compromised, the whole intervention was doomed to failure. During the last 3 tests, all of whose subjects Amos insisted had no families to speak of, Jones and Doyle had progressed into more invasive types of interventions. Subject 11 had been an interesting case, and the closest Jones and Doyle had come to having a problem on their hands. Though he initially exhibited the usual sequential symptoms of confusion and denial when confronted with relived footage that contradicted his human memories, Subject 11's denial persisted where insanity tended to follow in most others. This denial was strong enough to carry him to the seating station at his local Tasmart, where he voiced his suspicion that something was wrong with his recent Vista recordings. Jones and Doyle in C Division, watching like hawks as they always did, reverted his timeline to its original state just seconds before the trained seeders scanned through it. Subject 11 accepted the seeder's suggestion that it must have been a temporary glitch and shrugged it off. Despite this near disaster, or perhaps because of it, Jones and Doyle had learned important lessons from Subject 11's test. The key difference between the type of VRI they carried out on Subject 11 and the kind they used on the others was that rather than alter specific visual scenes or retroactively apply AR filters as they usually did, they had instead shuffled Subject 11's memories around by reordering 2 long sequences of events. This was an extremely invasive form of VRI that had never been tried before and would likely never be tried again. Subject 11, an unemployed man whose name neither Jones nor Doyle paid any attention to, had begun his day as he always did, by making himself a cup of coffee, then taking his dog for a 2-hour hike. On his return, he rustled up a large, late breakfast. Another 2 hours or so after this, Jones and Doyle spoofed an ad for a nearby cafe and sent it directly to the man's Vista. The ad contained a time counter, which ostensibly showed how long it had been since his last meal. Just under 5 hours. Almost positive that this figure was wrong, but with a sliver of doubt in his mind given how infallible the data used in ads usually was, Subject 11 rewound through his timeline until he saw the inside of his kitchen. The fact that he both drank his coffee and ate his breakfast in the kitchen was what made the messy cut and paste possible. Jones and Doyle in C Division simply isolated the entire passages of time he spent inside the kitchen and swapped them round. To Subject 11's extreme surprise, he pressed play to find himself staring down at a table empty but for a newspaper and a cup of coffee. He looked at the timestamp in the corner. No way, he muttered to himself, sure that he'd been eating breakfast at that time. He then skipped back to the moment he woke up and sped through the morning. In complete contradiction to what he remembered, the footage showed him eating breakfast before going for the hike. It didn't make sense. Jones and Doyle had been ecstatic at this point, but their joy wouldn't last. As Subject 11 continued fast-forwarding through his breakfast footage to see where his dog had been when he left the kitchen, something caught his eye. He slowed the footage to regular speed. What the... Jones and Doyle immediately blamed each other for the glaring oversight. When Subject 11 placed his dirty plate in the sink, the cup which had contained his early morning coffee was already sitting there, waiting to be washed. This was enough to decisively convince him that his relived timeline was playing up. He went to Tasmart immediately afterwards. Although relieved that Subject 11 put the glitch behind him without a second thought, Jones and Doyle both knew that they had flown too close to the sun. Reordering large chunks of footage was not a risk they would be taking again anytime soon. But Amos, more amiable in his dealings with these men than with almost anyone else, insisted that mistakes like this were precisely why the tests were being conducted. It was better to learn the ropes and slip up when the outcome didn't matter, he reassured them. His confidence motivated them to knuckle down and be more careful. They then took a clinical approach to Subject 12's intervention, following Amos's order to try and convince the relatively high-function meth addict that he had committed an unspeakable crime by strategically inserting pieces of virtual evidence into his timeline and obscuring all footage from the time when the incident was supposed to have taken place. Subject 12's poor memory and semi-regular blackouts made him something of a soft target, and the heinous nature of the crime he had been framed for was enough to prompt him to walk in front of a bus. The earlier death of Subject 10, which had been provoked by a relentless barrage of scattergun timeline manipulations that even Amos soon recognized as needlessly severe, was an event whose 3 witnesses had since agreed to never speak of again. It had never been Amos's express intention for any of the test subjects to kill themselves to escape their own madness or shame, but he and his hand-picked C Division staff were hardened enough to understand that they couldn't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs. They also knew that provoking suicide as a means to cleanly eliminate undesirable individuals was an important part of Amos's vision for VRI. In simple terms, suicide was cleaner than murder. And in equally simple terms, VRI was a cleaner way to provoke it than blackmail. This was true for the obvious reasons that blackmail often left tracks and necessarily alerted the target that someone had it in for them, which often brought out a fighting response. The same couldn't be said for VRI, because when VRI was done properly, subjects had no idea it was being done at all. After the sledgehammer approach to Subject 10's test, and the almost disastrous cut-and-paste job of Subject 11's, Amos instructed Jones and Doyle to conduct their 13th experiment in a clinical manner similar to that used on the meth-addicted Subject 12. Subject 13 would be nowhere near so easy to deceive, given that Amos had provided a set list of what he called junior professionals in the local area for Jones and Doyle to choose from, none of whom had either a propensity to black out nor a long history of self-loathing. "Who's next?" Jones asked, still trying to shake off the first-person footage of Subject 12's one-sided collision with a speeding bus. "Mr. Amos has given us a list of 10 names," Doyle said. "You can pick 1 to 10. "Let's go with 6. Jones pulled up the profile of the 6th man, their newly chosen Subject 13, and swiped it onto a communal viewing area on the tabletop in front of them. "Small world," Doyle said when he saw the man's face. "You know this guy?" Doyle gave an exaggerated nod. "You like him?" He shook his head. Jones grinned broadly. "Good." Story 7. Trixilicious. Trish by birth, Trixie to her friends, and Trixilicious to the 2.7 million consumers currently watching the world through her eyes via Sycamore's incredibly popular Star's Eye View app. Whatever you wanted to call her, she was a bona fide superstar. The numbers didn't lie. With an average of 50 million viewing hours logged each day, no one else came close. For Trixie, the 19-year-old failed model behind the Trixilicious persona, it had all happened far too quickly to sink in. "Hey, everyone!" she said, waving into her bedroom mirror as she walked past on the way to the kitchen. Her bedroom was plushly decorated with fluffy pillows and sparkling drapes. The kitchen, as everyone saw when she entered, was ultra-modern and almost overflowing with appliances. Much of Trixie's video output in the pre-Sycamore streaming days had focused on easier-than-it-looked food preparation and other domestic hacks, and a large portion of her fanbase had followed her to Star's Eye View. Her position as the most viewed Syca star of all certainly owed a lot to timing, and the fact that her online career had been on a steep upward trajectory when Sycamore's seed came along and changed everything. "Hello, boy!" Truman, Trixie's 5-month-old beagle, shuffled his way across the kitchen. Within seconds, words like Truman and aw and cute dominated the word map in the corner of Trixie's vision, which kept her abreast of viewer opinion by aggregating comments in real time and displaying the most used words in a large font. Trixie knew this would happen. This always happened. Seeing a cute dog set people up for the day, and she didn't doubt that a meaningful percentage of her viewers tuned in for her 7:30 alarm call, knowing that she would visit Truman immediately. With the first-person nature of Star's Eye View making it so much more immersive than any other form of entertainment, Trixie wasn't surprised to read frequent comments from viewers who felt like Truman was as big a star as she was. After all, he was in shot more often than she was. Walks with Truman regularly ranked among her most viewed segments, whenever in the day they occurred. Trixie couldn't pretend to understand the psychology that underpinned her huge success, and had been advised by her Sycamore rep that it was better not to think about it too deeply. "Don't worry about why people are watching," the rep had said. "Worry about how many." Trixie didn't even have to worry about that. Whatever she did, the numbers kept rising. Even on days when she didn't leave the house other than to take Truman out. In fact, especially on those days, the figures rose and rose and rose. "Should we go outside now or make some breakfast?" Trixie asked her viewers. "Vote outside or breakfast." She added the vote outside or breakfast emphasis at the end so that her viewers knew exactly what to say to cast their vote. Words like yes and no were too common in ordinary chat conversations to provide clear answers, as Trixie's Sycamore rep had told her countless times until it finally got through. Text communication to and from Sycamore was the only kind that ever showed up in Trixie's Vista without being visible to her viewers. Privacy, to the extent it still existed in Trixie's life, was strictly limited to her bathroom and equally strictly limited to 30 minutes per day. There were further restrictions to off-camera bathroom time, such as a limit of 5 visits per day and a blanket ban on all communication and connectivity while inside. Trixie had slowly grown accustomed to these rules and knew it could have been worse. Had she been one of the few male Syca stars, she would have been allowed only 20 minutes off-camera per day across a maximum of 3 bathroom visits. "Breakfast is winning," she said. 10 more seconds." Breakfast won by a landslide. Trixie chatted to her viewers and answered questions from those who had paid the going rate for an hour's access to the VIP section, which guaranteed that at least one of their comments would be directly addressed. The vast majority of Trixie's time was spent like this, doing and saying things that someone, somewhere down the line, was paying her to do or say. Some product placements were more forced than others. The various appliance manufacturers whose names she had to say a certain number of times during each use being a prime example, but Trixie had learned to pass it off as at least semi-natural. At first, Trixie saw the need to advertise so many things so often as the main drawback of her new career as a 24-hour streamer. For just as the dying days of the TV industry had seen entertainment content turn into nothing more than filler between ad breaks, Trixie understandably felt like her whole life was now a vehicle to make money for other people. She was making serious money for herself, of course, but each day she found herself wondering the same thing. What am I supposed to do with it? This question was particularly pertinent, given that everything from clothes and makeup to furniture and dog food was provided free of charge by companies keen to get their products in front of millions of eyes. The endless shilling grew more tiresome for Trixie by the hour. While most viewers lived vicariously through her eyes for a few hours each day, she was stuck with herself the whole time. She was stuck with the pop-ups telling her how many times she had to say each brand name within the next few minutes. She was stuck with the incessant do this, do that messages from her rep. And she was stuck with the overbearing superfans who spent more money than she could comprehend just to maintain a direct line of contact with her. On top of the absence of privacy and the constant need to advertise products, Trixie's Sycamore rep had recently added a new concern by informing her that several newly signed-up Syca stars were set to give her a run for her money as they challenged for the incredibly lucrative top spot. Her closest challenger so far was a man called Damien Dangerman who, as the name suggested, filled his time doing the most dangerous things he could think of. Damien was a familiar face from the pre-Sycamore streaming days who had, like Trixie, legally changed his name to match that of his persona. Even though Trixie's audience were an unusually loyal bunch, there were still an infinite number of entertainment options competing for their attention. The rise of Damien and others like him ramped this up another level. Though Trixie continued to smile and say her lines, the whole thing had stopped being fun a long time ago. In her pre-Sycamore life as a full-time internet personality, a working day had consisted of 4 or 5 hours spent making a handful of 5-minute videos. Now, full-time literally meant full-time. And with the ever-increasing competition, Trixie had to run faster just to stay in place. After breakfast and a walk with Truman, her viewing figures broke the 3 million barrier for the first time. A few commenters celebrated being present for the get, but there was no real fanfare. The best part of Trixie's day had been an unexpected exchange with a VIP commenter. It happened when she returned home with Truman and opened the street-facing window to let some air in. She passed comment on the flower beds which ran along the wall opposite from her building, zooming in on the flowers as they moved with the wind, and saying that she would never have known they were AR if they hadn't appeared so quickly. A VIP commenter named Naomi responded, "OMG, I did that. I work at Sycamore HQ in the studio, and the view from your house was the first big landscaping job I ever did." Trixie saw that Naomi was only 17, and did indeed work as a landscaper. VIP access didn't come cheap. It was, in fact, ridiculously expensive, so Trixie knew that the job must have paid well. "I would love a job like that," she said, responding out loud as she always did to questions from commenters. "I'm good at the art side, but not so much the computers." "I literally don't even know what to say right now," Naomi wrote in the VIP chat box. "Trixilicious knows I exist, and she's talking to me." Trixie's Sycamore rep prodded her to follow up on the art comment by asking her viewers to vote on whether she should give herself a manicure or a pedicure. Predictably, pedicure won out. As her toenails slowly dried, and an army of Star's Eye View workers tirelessly purged thousands of creepy feet-related comments, Trixie looked away from her toes and watched Truman fall asleep at her bedroom door. After spending longer than she realized ruminating on her negative thoughts from earlier in the day, she gestured in her palm without looking at it and sent a furtive message to her Sycamore rep. "I need a day off to recharge." The reply came almost immediately. "Stick in for 6 months and you can take the rest of your life off. Recharge, decharge, whatever you want. 6 months and it's all yours." Trixie had heard this line before. If the payout rate stayed constant and her viewing figures held up, it would actually take far less than 6 months for her to stockpile more money than she would ever need. The last time she tried to work it out, only 3 days earlier, she calculated that it would take only another 4 weeks or so to earn as much money as the average person made in a full working lifetime. But with everything weighing on her mind, and the pressure of an unprecedented magnifying glass hanging over her, 4 weeks seemed a long way away. 4 hours seemed a long way away. Right now, Trixie was at the stage where her favorite part of each day was its end, and her favorite view was the back of her eyelids. It was no way to live. "You're losing viewers," her rep warned in a new message. "Dropping back under 3 mil. Do something." Trixie looked at the stats. Her viewing figures were steady, but the word map told its own story. The largest word was boring, followed closely by change and Damien. "Say something about your hair," the next message said. "Anything, just say something. And look at something that's not the dog." Before Trixie said anything, one viewer's sarcastic question was picked up by countless others, until the comments section was plastered with row after row of the same thing. "What is this, the Truman Show? LOL." Trixie noticed this courtesy of her word map, which suddenly contained nothing but those 7 words. It didn't overly concern her since the behind-the-scenes team at Sycamore always dealt promptly with forced memes and spamming. Sure enough, the comments were gone within seconds. Trixie watched the live comments coming through. "That was weird. Glitch in the Matrix? Truman is the dog, right?" Only minutes after wanting out, Trixie breathed an audible sigh of relief that the comments section had returned to normal. She thought for a few seconds about how life was weird like that, always playing with her emotions, then snapped out of it and took action to stabilize the viewing figure as close to 3 million as possible. "So I guess my hair's been really weird today," she said. The word map lit up with words like hair and jealous and perfect. "Should I use the Frizz Killer or the Totes Amaze? Vote Frizz or Totes." The word map lit up again. "Good work," her rep said. Trixie didn't reply. Story 8. Mr. Denver. "Come on," Mr. Denver said, urging the 2 students dawdling through his classroom door to hurry up and take their seats. "It's your own time you're wasting." The children joined their 20 or so classmates who were already seated. Their digital textbooks, licensed as part of Sycamore's new classroom management system, were already locked to their respective desks and opened to the appropriate page. Within seconds, the children were immersed, quite literally, in their studies. Mr. Denver sat back and relaxed. The unbroken silence was still a novelty, but he could certainly get used to it. The teacher's own desk displayed the classroom management system's interface. Visible only to him, the CMS home screen gave him a broad overview of his students' progress. From there, he could look in greater detail at countless real-time metrics for each individual student, but he rarely had to. Between a detailed summary at the end of each class and the various alerts which informed him of potential lapses in student concentration, the default options gave Mr. Denver all the information he needed. In truth, they gave him a lot more than he needed. Mr. Denver's favorite feature was the alert the CMS gave him whenever a student looked away from their work for more than 10 consecutive seconds, or on more than 3 occasions in a 1-minute period. On top of this, he could click on any student's name to pull up their live vista and see exactly what they were looking at when it wasn't their work. The CMS also automatically alerted him whenever one student in his class tried to communicate with another via text. The fact that each student's digital textbook and answer sheets were visible only to them meant there was no need for a specific alert when a student tried to sneak a peek at someone else's work. Despite this, though, the CMS still let Mr. Denver know whenever two students made eye contact. After all, the CMS FAQ reliably informed him 72% of all multi-student disruptions began with furtive eye contact. This class had been one of Mr. Denver's easiest to control even before the CMS made his job so much simpler, as evidenced by the fact that only 2 of its members had been deemed to require virtual cubicles. These cubicles were exactly what they sounded like: virtual walls temporarily erected around the desks of the most easily distracted students, intended to help inattentive children focus without drawing attention to their difficulties. Mr. Denver had explained to each of the identified students, who were both boys, that their cubicles were there to assist rather than punish them. One of the boys boasted to his classmates about being locked up. The other kept it to himself. 2 weeks later, these 2 boys' performance had improved even more markedly than the rest of their classmates. The CMS software took it upon itself to refine each student's personal performance by testing the effects of different kinds of music and relaxing sound effects on their concentration and productivity. All in all, there was a lot more going on behind the scenes than Mr. Denver understood. Like so many other aspects of Sycamore's ecosystem, a form of the CMS had been in development for several years before Sycamore brought out the developers. The rapid societal changes since the night Kurt Jacobs changed the world by sharing his idea of the seed, chief among them the legislation which made seeding both free and compulsory for schoolchildren, had led Sycamore to rush the product out. The original plans for the CMS were based upon a classroom setting in which the students wore smart glasses. Sycamore's Outtro lenses were naturally a massive step up from that, and the seed provided the additional benefit of an input method unrivaled in terms of both practicality and precision. The seed, conveniently implanted as it was in each student's left palm, also allowed school staff to monitor students' movements without the need for anything like the fallible tracker attached to their backpacks method that Mr. Denver had come across at his previous school. It hadn't always been plain sailing, though. In the days before the safety-motivated decision to mandate free seeding for all school-age children, and particularly in the first few days after the seed's public launch, the new technology had been incredibly disruptive. The problem was two-pronged. On one hand, Mr. Denver and his colleagues couldn't confiscate seeds like they could phones. On the other, the children whose parents couldn't afford to buy seeds at launch were mercilessly teased by those whose parents could. There had only been a few days between the launch of the seed and the release of the bare-bones CMS, but those days had been chaotic. Mr. Denver's classroom, like every other, was more of a jungle than a place of learning. With no CMS to restrict the children from taking photos of each other and throwing them at the classroom walls after editing them in embarrassing ways, Mr. Denver was helpless. In some ways, the children behaved as they had on the old social media sites, just with the added immediacy of seeing each other's reactions to their hilarious pictures and memes. Having never previously owned a pair of Ultra lenses and having been unable to get to a Tasmart store before work on the day the seed launched, Mr. Denver was a step behind the handful of students who arrived late after getting their own seeds. He therefore hadn't been able to see what they were laughing at. He saw all of the childish virtual graffiti on his walls and whiteboard the next day. Mostly penises, as always seemed to be the case, but remained powerless to stop it until the first version of the CMS arrived a few days later. Everything changed then. The only thing that Mr. Denver would have liked to have been able to restrict more than he could was the students' use of RealU. Children came to class looking different every day, circumventing the school's makeup policy by attaining their look of choice via RealU rather than a physical application. That policy, like so many others in all walks of life, was in desperate need of a rewrite. Mr. Denver consoled himself that the school's recognition as a designated PWE, place of work/education, at least placed a blanket ban on novelty and transformative modifications. But some of the subtle changes possible via RealU's corrections menu still made some of his students look almost like different people. The one commonality was that every RealU user looked older than before. Most of the class, and seemingly the school as a whole, appeared to have aged 5 years in 5 weeks. This was most noticeable among the girls, for many of whom RealU had devolved into something of an arms race, as they spent money they didn't have to meet higher and higher standards. When it came to how the students viewed the new CMS-based school experience, many had initially been vocal in their distaste. Some complained of being treated like prisoners, while others compared the minute-by-minute regimentation they faced to that forced upon workers in a sweatshop. Mr. Denver owed the silence and cooperation of his current class to the way he responded to their concerns. Unlike other teachers who told the children to shut up and remember that a school was a place for learning rather than having fun, Mr. Denver took a different approach by presenting the changes as an opportunity. Some other teachers did this too, of course, but Mr. Denver once again took a different approach. Instead of telling his students that the CMS could help them learn more, he told them it could help them learn the same amount in less time. This got their attention, and the deal he struck was simple. In short, he would tell the CMS that his class lasted 50 minutes rather than 60. As soon as a student finished the 50 minutes worth of work that the CMS assigned them based on their ability level and regular pace, that student could do whatever they wanted for the rest of the class. After 2 weeks, students were now averaging 48 minutes to complete more work than they used to get through in 60. The move from 60 minutes of diluted concentration to 50 minutes of absolute focus followed by a 10-minute break, as trivial as it sounded, paid dividends for everyone. The final 12 minutes were as chaotic as anything in the few days between the seed's launch and the arrival of the CMS, but Mr. Denver didn't mind. With productivity, attainment, morale, and every other measurable variable significantly up across the board, how could he? 5 minutes into today's class, and with the CMS guiding each student through their studies, Mr. Denver stood up and walked between the rows of silent students. He could definitely get used to this. 2 desks at the back were empty, reminding him that he hadn't checked the CMS's attendance report. He returned to his desk and clicked into the report. It told him that Jennifer Turner's absence was authorized, but that David Brown's wasn't. Given that David was a model student, Mr. Denver didn't anticipate any foul play. Since David wasn't in the classroom, Mr. Denver didn't have access to his real-time vista. But because David was supposed to be in the classroom, Mr. Denver did have access to his real-time location. As expected, David was at home. Mr. Denver asked David via text why he wasn't in school and when he expected to return. He received confirmation immediately that the message had been received, but David didn't reply for several minutes. When he did, the answer was unexpected. Hopefully tomorrow. I'm looking after my brother right now. Short notice, long story. If you send my work, I'll do it tonight to catch up. Mr. Denver didn't know what to say in reply. He knew it wasn't a lie. David wouldn't lie to him, and no one would choose a lie like that when so many simpler options were available. But nor was it an acceptable reason to miss class. He looked around the room, then clicked the name Gareth Carr. As David's best and perhaps only friend in the class, Gareth was more likely than anyone else to know why he wasn't in school. Mr. Denver asked Gareth this very question via text. Gareth looked up and replied out loud, "You didn't see?" "See what?" "There was major drama with his parents. His dad got showed up by Everstrong, didn't believe it was an accident, then started posting all kinds of tit-for-tat bullcrap on Forrest, airing all their dirty laundry, you know. He ended up leaving." "Is he okay? David, I mean, not his dad. When do you think he'll be back in school?" Gareth blew air from his lips and shrugged. "It depends. Everyone is talking about it now, but something else will probably come up today. Someone else will lose their mind or post something they meant to keep private. You know what attention spans are like. By the end of the day, no one will care, and by tomorrow, no one will even remember. He's just lying low until this blows over." "Okay," Mr. Denver said. He understood what Gareth meant. When people drew any kind of negative attention these days, the pile-ons were more intense but more fleeting than ever before. That was just the nature of a hyper-connected social world. Every mistake and every embarrassment was amplified, but there was always a bigger one right around the corner. Mr. Denver spent the next 40 minutes reading through the mentions on David's Forrest profile. David hadn't posted for almost 2 days. since writing an innocuous review of a movie he'd just watched. But there were literally thousands of comments from people talking about him and his parents' very recent and very public split, focusing particularly on the video obtained by Everstrong Fidelity Check and unwittingly posted by his mother, which had quickly gone viral. It was a sorry state of affairs. 46 minutes into class, an alert came through that a student had finished their work for the day. The alerts came in rapidly over the next few minutes. By 53 minutes, everyone was finished. This was quite incredible, given that several of the students had typically achieved almost nothing before the CMS arrived. But today, Mr. Denver was too consumed by how they were spending their free time to be glad that they'd earned it. With the CMS restrictions on content sharing disabled, students plastered the classroom walls with the compromising photos and uncomfortably personal details posted by David's mother the previous evening. The only positive Mr. Denver could find was that David wasn't there to see it. As the classroom emptied shortly afterwards, Mr. Denver instructed the CMS to prepare for the next class. He looked through the students in the class to see how many were registered as absent. Just one. Haley Jones. Unable to see where Haley was until the scheduled start of the next class, at which point she would become his responsibility, Mr. Denver pulled up Haley's Forest profile to check her recent public posts. Her profile was temporarily muted. This was unusual for anyone, but particularly for a popular high school student like Haley. Intrigued, Mr. Denver looked through her public mentions. The messages, posted about her by others, followed a common theme. Comments like, "Epic fail," and "Next time click private," hinted at what had happened. And after another minute or so, Mr. Denver was left in no doubt that Haley had accidentally shared an intimate picture publicly rather than privately. Just like David, Haley was lying low. But Mr. Denver knew that the nature of her mishap meant it would take longer to blow over than David's, so he extended the length of her authorized absence to 3 days. Students from the next class began to arrive, whispering about Haley under their breaths as they entered the classroom. Mr. Denver told them to sit down and be quiet. The CMS took it from there. He didn't utter another word until students began to finish their work, at which time he ordered them all to shut up about Haley and to stop plastering the picture on his walls, edited or not. As simple as the CMS made Mr. Denver's life as a teacher now, he was unspeakably glad that everything else had been so much less complicated when he was a student way back when. Story 9. Jasmine. 3 days after winning a colossal SycaLotto jackpot on her 21st birthday, Jasmine Coulson sat alone in her recently redecorated bedroom. Placing expensive artwork and other augmented flourishes around the room had been fun at first, but the novelty had already worn off. After an illusion-shattering video chat with her best friend, Jasmine returned the room to its default, unaugmented state. She ignored the notice about the irreversibility of doing so and the lack of refunds. It wasn't as though the decorating had made any kind of dent in her balance. This bedroom, now back in its original state, was just about the only thing in Jasmine's life that looked the same as it had a few days earlier. Depressingly, few of the changes had been for the better. Jasmine by no means wanted to rewind time and stop herself from claiming the jackpot, but there were certain things she wished she could undo. Though Sycamore had taken the decision to go public about the win out of Jasmine's hands, she deeply regretted agreeing to give a spur-of-the-moment interview while celebrating with her friends in Lance's bar. Though the millions of friend requests that came in the wake of her appearance were amusing at first, Jasmine had quickly been forced to accept a Sycamore pop-up suggestion to hire a small army of digital assistants to manage her forest profile. She employed them in an effort to work through the backlog and to make sure that messages from her real friends made it through the deluge and reached a curated inbox. The initial influx of comments Jasmine saw before handing the reins to her new assistants fell into 3 broad groups: unsolicited comments on her looks, one way or the other, general words of congratulations, and aggressively worded rants insisting that she didn't deserve the money, as though she had ever claimed that she did. It got worse as the first night went on, with clickbait peddling news outlets combing through every inch of Jasmine's online history for something to sensationalize. Jasmine wasn't worried about what they might find. More than anything, she just couldn't understand why anyone cared. She was no one, just an ordinary person who happened to win a lot of money. The overnight celebrity effect was deeper in Jasmine's case than ever before. In the pre-Sycamore days, she had seen plenty of instances of people begging to be left alone after being mentioned or retweeted by powerful people with large fan bases. She had likewise seen countless people jokingly saying, "R.I.P. inbox," upon receiving an influx of messages after something about them went viral. But what she was going through now was on another level altogether. There was a simple reason for this. In Jasmine's case, the entity which had decided to bring her to everyone's attention was Sycamore itself. The Cinderella story of a shy, poor, and conventionally attractive young woman winning a massive jackpot on her 21st birthday was too good for Sycamore not to milk for everything it was worth. The story was in fact so good that many openly questioned whether it was all part of a pre-planned advertising campaign for the SycaLotto. Jasmine wasn't quite sure whether people were suggesting that she hadn't really won the money, or just that Sycamore fixed the draw to make sure that she would. Either way, she knew there was nothing she could do to convince them she wasn't in on it, so didn't even try. The morning after that manic first night, Jasmine spent a small but non-negligible chunk of her winnings in the one app that had targeted her more than any other for the last 5 weeks. RealU. Jasmine had been self-conscious about her nose for as long as she could remember, as Sycamore's ad-targeting algorithms knew from the conversations she had about it. Almost every morning for 5 weeks, she had seen the same ad in the bathroom mirror while brushing her teeth. A side-by-side comparison of what she looked like now and what she could look like if she paid the going rate for a nose correction. As insidious as this was, it worked. Other ads had even gone further, pointing out flaws that Jasmine didn't even know she had. The constant reminders of her imperfections had been so effective in crushing Jasmine's self-confidence that she didn't even resent Sycamore for pointing them out, but instead felt grateful that RealU provided her the opportunity to correct them. These corrections hadn't been within Jasmine's reach before the SycaLotto win, but once the money was in her account, she quickly seized her chance to make full use of RealU's controversial Fix Me feature. This feature, which had been criticized by one politician for its, quote, borderline harassment of girls and young women, invited consumers to enter their maximum budget and then automatically rationed every penny of it to give them the best structural makeover possible. The process was based on the detailed responses of focus group participants who had been asked to rate the attractiveness of thousands of faces. Sycamore's statisticians and programmers turned the results into a complex series of ratios and formulae based on 26 variables encompassing everything from jaw definition to nose length. Fix Me did nothing to alter consumers' hairstyles or clothing, and didn't include surface-level modifications, such as skin cleansing or teeth whitening, both of which were already immensely popular as daily subscriptions. Fix Me's modifications also expired after 1 month, unless the consumer renewed the service, which meant that most couldn't afford any changes that went beyond what used to be attainable via a professional makeup application and some extensive photoshopping. Jasmine, however, was now unbound by such financial restrictions. She excitedly ticked the No Budget box and clicked Fix Me. RealU got to work at making her augmented appearance, which was to all intents and purposes her only appearance, given that it was all anyone would see, as attractive as it possibly could without crossing the invisible line at which Sycamore's technology distinguished accentuation from transformation. The results were as perfect as Jasmine hoped. She looked and felt like a movie star. The joy didn't last long, though. Within minutes of sharing some mirror-shot selfies with a handful of her real friends, Jasmine received a notice from one of her overworked digital assistants that the images had been leaked via a well-known celebrity gossip app. The changes being seen by people wasn't a problem. That was the whole point, after all. But Jasmine was both angered by the fact that one of her friends had sold the photos, and also hurt by the kind of comments people were making. Looks like you can't buy class. Leaked? AKA she sent them in herself for attention, #desperate. All that money and she spends it on this, while kids are literally starving, SMH. Face better, but body needs work. These comments were posted within a gossip app which catered to lonely readers who were seasoned experts in the art of dealing with their own sadness by attacking others, so Jasmine tried not to take it all too personally. Her digital assistants, apparently doubling as de facto PR advisors, recommended a proactive response. Jasmine fully supported their suggestion to make a public donation to a children's charity, even if it did feel more than a little like kowtowing. She authorized a large donation in the evening of her first day after the big win. Sadly, the public responses that greeted her the following morning were less than kind. OMG, someone please tell this girl that charity does not exist to get her positive coverage. This is so gross, I can't even. What is this? Like 0.1% of what she won? Do I get a pat on the back if I give them a penny? Talk about transparent. The snarky and dismissive tone of the gossip app's article lay at the root of these negative comments, prompting Jasmine's digital assistants to encourage her to, quote, bring the editors on side by paying them and other outlets for favorable coverage. After a principled but brief protest, Jasmine eventually deferred to her assistants' wisdom when they told her that this modern form of protection money was, quote, just part of the business. It didn't seem to matter that Jasmine didn't want to be in the business in the first place. This was apparently her life now, and all she wanted to do was make it as bearable as possible. She spoke up to ask whether she could instead pay the main news and gossip outlets to refrain from posting anything about her instead of paying them for positive coverage. After doing some digging and striking some deals, one of her assistants returned with the answer, a qualified yes. Unfortunately for Jasmine, the qualification was a major one. The gossip app that had first leaked Jasmine's RealU modifications agreed to stop publishing articles about her and to delete all existing reader comments in exchange for a fee she didn't care to ask about, and other medium-sized outlets were equally receptive. So far, so good. But what's the qualification? Jasmine asked. Who is going to keep publishing stuff about me? Sycamore, you're going to be the new face of the SycaLotto. Huge campaign starts tomorrow. Jasmine immediately called her best friend to talk about how overwhelmed and trapped she was feeling given everything that had been going on. She walked into the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror for the video chat so that her friend would see her face rather than the floor or ceiling or anything else. Having purchased unlimited access to Reader, Sycamore's visual mood and lie-detecting app, Jasmine saw jealousy and resentment literally etched on her best friend's face as soon as the call began. Hurt and upset, but too emotionally exhausted to broach the topic, she made an excuse to end the call, then solemnly returned to her bedroom and collapsed onto the bed. The fancy, augmented decorations all around the room suddenly felt out of place, incongruous with how she felt and almost taunting in their perfection. Jasmine reverted the room to its original unaugmented state and now lay again on the bed, looking up at the unevenly painted ceiling. Can one of you find out if I can buy a new account? She scribbled into her hand, composing a message for her assistants. New name, new everything. Whatever it costs, I'll pay it. Each of them answered within seconds, all in the negative. Jasmine had realistically expected nothing else. She decided to call it a night since no one could hassle her in her sleep or when she was watching something in full immersion with all notifications disabled. When she was brushing her teeth before settling in bed for the night, the familiar RealU logo popped up on her mirror. She wondered what it had found to criticize now. Congrats on your recent corrections, the ad said, appearing on her mirror in fancy pink letters. Doesn't looking good feel great? Jasmine sighed, swiped away the ad, and sent another message to her assistants. Can I at least pay to block ads? She already knew the answer. Story 10. Subject 13. Undisturbed in their corner office in the canopy of Sycamore HQ, Jones and Doyle, C Division's masterful VRI technicians, spent 5 minutes researching the recent trajectory of their next test subject's life. In one word, downward. To add another, steep. The user data beside Subject 13's head: Adam Pike, 31, married, software engineer, was only partially correct given that Adam had been looking for work since being let go from his previous job 3 months earlier and had still found nothing. The nature of Adam's contract meant that he was still being paid and would be for another few weeks. But Doyle, who had crossed paths with him in a personal matter some years earlier, felt that unemployed was a truer summary of Adam's current situation than software engineer. The closest Adam had come to securing new work was obtaining a sought-after interview at Victory World Gaming, but the disaster that unfolded in the company's meeting room left him wishing his application had been rejected at the first stage. In the few days since then, Adam had evidently given up on finding another job in his field anytime soon, and had turned his attention towards lower-paying retail work. The live footage on Jones and Doyle's large communal desk showed that Adam was currently distributing printed resumes to stores at that very moment. "How do you know this loser anyway?" Jones asked. "Long story." "What was her name?" Doyle's expression briefly acknowledged his colleague's incisively accurate wit, but also made clear that he didn't want to expand on the story any further. Jones took the hint. "Doesn't look like he's doing too well for himself," he said. "Seriously, how desperate do you have to be to go from applying for a job at Victory to begging for work at the kind of crappy little stores that still take paper resumes?" "I want to mess with him," Doyle said, ignoring the point Jones made. "There are 9 more names on the list who we can use for the proper test, right?" "Yeah? So why don't we have some fun?" "Mr. Amos gave us a specific task," Jones said. "And we'll do it, right after we switch out this idiot's resumes." "Switch them out for what?" Doyle opened a private browsing window in his Vista and searched for an appropriately inappropriate image. He laughed when he found a good one, then swiped it onto the desk. Jones shook his head and suppressed a chuckle. "How old are you supposed to be?" "You in?" Doyle asked. "It'll be funny." "What's the plan?" Doyle smiled. It was as good as a yes. He then explained that all he would do was place the image on the visible page of each printed resume that Adam Pike, Subject 13, had already left in a store, either on top of an existing pile or by itself on the counter. The changes would only be visible within Adam's relived timeline and not in real time, of course, so no unsuspecting store owners would be subjected to the obscene image. "So who will see them?" Jones asked, not following Doyle's logic. "If we're only modifying the resumes within the subject's timeline, no one is going to see, not even him. What's the point? This is like that tree falling in the woods thing." "I'm going to spoof him an angry message in a few hours," Doyle said. "I'll pretend to be from one of the stores, and I'll ask why the hell he left a disgusting photo in my resume pile. He'll look back and see them all and start freaking out." "Sounds dangerous. Rule 1 is don't get caught. And however much of an idiot this guy is, he's not going to think he somehow accidentally handed in a random picture instead of a resume. He'll know something's up. I know people believe their eyes, but there is a limit. I just want to give him a fright. It's hardly the kind of thing he's going to report. And so what if he does? We'll just undo it before he shows anyone, and they'll think he's crazy." "I don't know," Jones said. "I can spoof him the message as soon as he leaves the shopping center if you want," Doyle suggested. "That way you can watch me undo it all a few minutes later and you'll know it's safe." Jones thought it over. "It's literally impossible for us to get caught." "I know, but people have died because of what we've done in here," Doyle said. "You were in charge of the test that made the meth head kill himself. And guess what? No one cared. I acted in accordance with direct orders from Mr. Amos. What you're suggesting now is that we defy his orders. He ordered us to carry out the next test. He didn't say we couldn't have fun for a few minutes before we start. I just think... Jones trailed off, running out of arguments as his resistance faded. Doyle seized his chance. Come on, man. It'll be like the fun we used to have before all this. Just a little prank. There's no harm in that, right? I only need 15 minutes. I'll be counting, Jones said. Doyle smiled and got to work. Adam Pike placed his 16th resume of the day on the counter of a thrift store and returned to the shopping center's pathway, his shoulders low. The shopping center was almost deserted, which went some way to explain why so many store owners had been upfront about telling Adam they weren't hiring, and why so many other stores were boarded up. In a world where people dressed themselves in virtual clothes and lived online, all but a few kinds of physical stores were dying out. Adam sometimes wondered what was going to happen to the economy given that fewer and fewer consumers were earning the money they needed to keep consuming. Shortly after exiting the thrift store, and with these thoughts still in his mind, Adam noticed 2 CrimePrev agents walking straight towards him. Like everyone else, Adam naturally knew all about the kind of work that CrimePrev agents carried out. But this was the first time he'd ever seen one in real life. His conscience wasn't particularly guilty, but their presence sent his heart rate and his mind racing simultaneously. Were the agents going to walk past? Or were they there for him? CrimePrev, in simple terms, existed to track and prevent criminal activity. A dedicated team of scanners worked tirelessly in Sycamore's CrimePrev division just a few floors below the canopy, analyzing live Vista streams for suspicious activity and flagging would-be criminals for their superiors to deal with. Some preemptive interventions were automated, such as the warnings which popped up whenever a consumer looked likely to indulge in any kind of copyright infringement or intellectual property abuse. These warnings were based on keywords and phrases which the system recognized as indicators of criminal intent when spoken or written in certain contexts. Similarly, automated warnings were in development to notify individuals looking to sell illegal drugs that they would face the full force of the law if they went through with it. Other interventions required a more hands-on approach from CrimePrev agents. Consumers' forest posts and other social activity were automatically analyzed to detect unusual changes in mood or discussion topics, with human agents then looking into each flagged consumer to see if there was anything worthy of concern. The most high-profile incident so far had occurred just a few days previously, when a sudden shift to, quote, potentially suicidal postings on a 16-year-old boy's forest profile had been flagged up by the system and handed over to a human agent. When the agent looked deeper, he saw that the boy was right then on his way to shoot up his school. The cryptic posts and other clues were the kind which would typically have been shown in news broadcasts after the tragedy occurred, as everyone asked why they hadn't been spotted sooner. This time, however, they had been spotted in time. This time, for the first time, CrimePrev had undeniably saved lives. But despite lofty rhetoric and the early success stories, CrimePrev's introduction wasn't motivated by a sense of public duty. For as anyone who knew Sycamore's top man could attest, Isaiah Amos was and always had been a power for its own sake kind of guy. CrimePrev, and the abstract concept of preemptive criminal interventions more generally, was hugely popular with the public following a merciless propaganda campaign. The campaign's core message, that countless lives would be saved and that no one would ever be punished without reason, resonated particularly strongly with parents and young women, the 2 groups who had been targeted most by the propaganda ads. As with other inherently controversial applications of Sycamore's new technologies and centralized data management, Isaiah Amos had well understood the folly of launching CrimePrev on an unwilling public. Just like currency digitization and compulsory seeding, it wasn't enough for Amos to placate consumers' concerns to the point that they would tolerate CrimePrev. No, he wanted consumers to demand it. He wanted them to embrace it. And embrace it they did. The only real opposition to CrimePrev that Amos had to overcome came before he even revealed the concept to the public, when his request for public funding met ideological resistance at the highest level. It was put to Amos that law enforcement agencies already utilize metadata from previous incidents to predict the likelihood of violent crimes being committed in particular areas at particular times, thus allowing the strategic placement of officers to dissuade would-be offenders. The inefficiency inherent in this approach offended Amos as much as its ineffectiveness. If the current system was so good, he said, why were there still so many crimes? Amos also flatly rejected the notion that meaningful preemptive interventions were already used to thwart terrorist plots. As he explained, these interventions inevitably came when actual crimes had already been committed, be it the procurement of illegal weapons or conspiracy to murder. CrimePrev agents, on the other hand, would have the benefit of Sycamore's unprecedented access to consumers' every movement and every comment, enabling them to act before the illegality occurred. The ideological opposition to Amos's plan was then stated in its purest and most distilled form. You're suggesting that we punish the innocent? No, Amos said. I'm suggesting that we protect their innocence. He knew it was a good line. Crimes don't have to happen. That's the whole point. CrimePrev agents were lionized across the broad spectrum of Sycamore's news and entertainment output. Adam Pike had been mind-jacked into respecting their work just like everyone else had. But the only thing he felt as the two agents walking towards him came ever closer was a desperate hope that they would walk straight past. They didn't. "Can we have a quick word, Mr. Pike?" asked the taller and older of the two men. Adam panicked at first, momentarily forgetting that his name was visible in the air beside his head, and taking the fact that the agent knew it as a sign that he was in trouble. "What's going on?" he asked. "We're responding to a report of movement tax avoidance." "I've never skipped a payment," Adam insisted. "I swear I've paid every single—" "Mr. Pike," the agent interrupted, "you're not in any kind of trouble." Adam had never felt more relieved. "We received a report of a consumer sneaking into a nearby store to falsely validate his journey without making a purchase, and thus avoid paying the applicable movement tax. Unfortunately, the store's owner wasn't at the counter at the time, so we don't have any clear footage." "What about the perp's footage?" "It doesn't show his face." "But you must know who he is. Can't you track his location and either arrest him or apply the charge?" "Of course we know who and where he is," the agent said. "And he's already been charged the full amount plus an avoidance fee. But while we do have his footage, we would very much like to see a third-person view of the incident to determine his expression and body language at the time. You see, as hard as it is to believe, there are some store owners out there who have been turning a blind eye to movement tax avoidance. If the perpetrator looked as calm as his slow movements suggest, if he looked like he knew there was no worry of being caught, then we'll have reason to investigate the store owner in question with the aim of preventing future infractions." "But didn't you just say that you had a report of the incident?" Adam asked, confused. "Why would the owner report it if he was in on it?" "The report came from the system. It's all automated. We were the nearest agents, so we were called. It happened very recently, which is why we're hoping you can help." "I don't see how I can," Adam said. "Have you been here for long? 30 minutes or so?" "Longer than that. But I've been inside some of the stores handing in resumes, so I might have missed the guy." "Can we take a look at your timeline to check if you crossed paths?" Adam nodded. "Of course." He then navigated into Relive, selected the last hour of footage, and swiped it through the air to the agents. "This is bad," Doyle said. "You think I don't know that?" Jones snapped at him. "They're going to know something's up. They're looking at his Vista, which you decided it would be funny to mess around with." "How the hell was I supposed to know he'd run into CrimePrev agents in the middle of a shopping center?" Jones shook his head and looked at the floor. "Mr. Amos isn't going to like this." He was right. Amos naturally planned to integrate the work of his VRI technicians with CrimePrev at some point in the future. But right now, no one at CrimePrev even knew that Vista recording intervention was a real thing. Their finding out from anyone other than Amos, and especially in a manner like this, could cause serious issues within Sycamore's inner circle. Jones and Doyle were understandably more concerned about themselves. After all, they knew better than anyone else how few qualms Amos had about eliminating people who caused him problems. "I'll take the fall," Doyle said. "I let my private life interfere, so I'll take the fall. I'll call him right now." "Who?" "Mr. Amos. It's better if he hears it from us. From me. And he might even be able to use his remote access to override the agent's access to the footage, or scramble it all, or something. There's no time for us to undo the changes, but if he could press a button to temporarily suspend Pike's account—" "Do it then," Jones said impatiently. He was watching live footage through Adam Pike's eyes as the CrimePrev agent scanned through the oblivious man's recent timeline. Amos answered the voice call straight away. "Doyle," he said, sounding in good spirits. "What do you have for me?" Doyle explained the situation as succinctly as he could. To his surprise, Amos's reaction was uncharacteristically measured. Rather than do something drastic like suspend Adam's account or lock the agents out of his timeline, Amos opted to see how things played out. He told Doyle he would leave his 22nd floor office and come up to the canopy right away, then thanked him for bringing the issue to his attention. "What did he say?" Jones said, having heard only Doyle's side of the call. "He's coming up." Jones put his hands on his head. "He's not angry," Doyle sought to clarify. "He said the agents have so little idea that VRI is possible that they'll either think there's been a glitch, or they'll just think Pike's lying to them." Though Jones didn't share Amos's confidence, he was glad to hear that the typically short-fused man wasn't angry. "Besides," Doyle said, "what's the worst that can happen? Mr. Amos is on our side. If they find out something's wrong, they're the ones in trouble." Jones hadn't thought of this, but it did make some sense. The taller and older of the two CrimePrev agents noticed the obscene sketch on one of Adam Pike's resumes just as Isaiah Amos arrived in C Division's corner office. Amos looked down at the footage on the desk and laughed heartily. "This is what you're worried about," he said, turning to Doyle. "It's flawless. I know that drawing is really a resume, and I can't even tell. These brilliant agents aren't going to believe some random guy on the street over their own eyes. Here it comes. Everyone, shh." Jones slid the master volume up so they could all hear Adam Pike and the CrimePrev agents clearly through their own in-ear phones. Amos took over and made the screen display the agent's live vista rather than Adam's, so he could get a nice third-person view of the innocent man's face when the inevitable accusation came. "You say you've been distributing resumes?" the agent asked. Adam nodded. "So what the hell am I watching? Are you some kind of pervert?" Adam stood silently, his face contorted. Eventually he forced out a word. "What?" "This!" the agent yelled. He swiped a still image of the footage across to Adam, showing the moment when he placed an obscene picture on top of a pile of resumes on the counter of a used bookstore. "I didn't do that," Adam insisted. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a handful of resumes. "See?" "So the footage is lying?" Adam hesitated. "Well, yeah." He knew how crazy this sounded, but it was true. "Go into the store and check. My resume will be there." Doyle and Jones watched on nervously. They hadn't thought of this, and quickly regretted modifying the distributed resumes only in Adam's timeline, rather than applying the changes universally. Both feared that this decision, taken to protect innocent store owners from unnecessary exposure to the image, was about to come back to bite them in the ass. "They won't check," Amos said, reading the men's body language. "I mean, would you? If you didn't know about VRI, would you go into the stores to check? It's like if a kid tells you there's a monster under their bed. You don't have to check, because you know the kid's a stupid idiot." On the desk and in their ears, the footage continued to play. "You're only making it worse for yourself if you keep lying once you've been caught," the agent told Adam. "Just a little tip, you sick pervert." "Listen to me," I didn't do this. I'm telling you the truth. Exact same thing in the next store, boss, the junior agent said, speaking for the first time. Look. The young agent swiped the damning footage to his colleague, who watched for a few seconds, then stepped towards Adam. Adam Pike, he said, I hereby exercise my authority as an agent of Sycamore's CrimePrev division to lawfully detain you with the aim of preventing future infractions. Detain me? For what? Public indecency, not to mention lying to a CrimePrev agent. Amos cracked his knuckles and walked slowly towards the window of C Division's expansive corner office. Jones closed the video window on the desk and looked silently at Doyle. Amos had seemed upbeat before he walked away, but he was rarely an easy man to read. Seconds later, Amos called the men towards him with his hand. The three of them looked down at the city's exclusive quarter-mile district. Consumers wandered along every path, their every action providing either easy profit or priceless data for Sycamore's various divisions. The division for which Amos had the highest hopes of all, his two-man C Division, had just proven its worth. This is a magical moment, Amos mused, placing one hand on Jones's back and one on Doyle's as he stood between them. I always saw the potential in framing people we need rid of rather than driving them to suicide. It's a lighter alternative, you know? Less conspicuous in certain cases. But I never really considered that we could frame them for crimes that haven't even been committed, and that CrimePrev agents would do the rest. Jones and Doyle knew better than to interrupt Amos when he was in one of his trances like this. There's no stumbling point, he continued. This proves that you two can convince CrimePrev agents that your VRI modifications are real, which means all we need to do to get rid of someone is plant a piece of evidence that makes it look like they'll commit a crime sometime in the future. It doesn't even need to be a physical modification like the resumes. It could just be a comment. This will be so much easier than using VRI to frame them for doing something in the past. We're not talking about CrimePrev plus VRI. This is CrimePrev times VRI. It's synergy, boys. Synergy. Amos then startled both men by clapping his hands together loudly and suddenly. Who owns the past? He asked. Neither said anything, unsure whether he was being rhetorical. Don't be shy. Doyle, who owns the past? We do, Doyle said. Jones? We do, Jones said more decisively. Right. Now together. Who owns the past? They replied in slightly reluctant unison. We do. Excellent. And who owns the future? We do, they said. Amos patted them both on the back and walked away towards the door. Wrong, he said after a few seconds, facing them again. I do. Story 11. Funscreen Redux. Even before it ratted him out to the police for smoking something he shouldn't have, Danny Birch had hated his family's Funscreen more than anything else in the world. Were it not for the fact that 100% of his unemployed father's income came in the form of funfair credits earned by enduring soul-destroying ad placements for countless hours every day, Danny would have smashed the Funscreen to pieces long ago. He went to bed at night fantasizing about doing it. He dreamed about it. He woke in the morning wishing there was a way, any way, that he could eliminate the Funscreen without condemning his family to an even worse financial position than the one they were already in. Every time he walked through the living room, Danny pictured himself going for it and laying into the Funscreen like a wild animal, all thrashing fists and headbutts. He pictured blood dripping from his forehead, pieces of shattered glass stuck in his knuckles, the Funscreen's guts all over the floor. Most satisfyingly of all, Danny pictured himself standing triumphantly in front of the defeated Funscreen's broken shell and taunting it with a twist on its own incessant request. Please rate the previous beatdown in terms of enjoyment and interest. Danny had no illusions that these were normal thoughts for a 16-year-old to have, but he flat-out refused to accept the Funscreen itself as anything close to normal. It sickened him how easily Funscreens had been accepted by mainstream society, with even those critical of the private welfare system which underpinned their introduction hesitant to complain too much, since the Americans had it, quote, so much worse, with Sycamore's privacy-killing seed and ultra lenses. He didn't care about Sycamore. That was the Americans' problem. What he cared about was the goddamn spy screen hanging in his living room, watching and listening to everything he said and did. Until one fateful night a week earlier, Danny's main gripe with the Funscreen had been the ads. The virtual before and afters of his face, which had been mocked up by his, quote, good friends at Zitkilla to sell him an expensive acne cream, were bad enough. But it was too much for him to accept when the same technique was used to sell his 11-year-old sister weight loss pills that she didn't even need. That was what really got to Danny. It wasn't just the fact that the new private welfare system ushered in by the austerity-loving fat cats in London forced people to watch ads all day for the luxury of a trivial payment. It was the type of ads that the Funscreen selected. Ads which made people feel insecure enough to make an immediate purchase were the Funscreen's bread and butter, and viewers knew they couldn't look away lest their already paltry payment be reduced courtesy of an interruption penalty. But the truly sinister aspect of the Funscreen became clear over the course of one recent evening, beginning when Danny voiced his desire to smash the screen, and it replied automatically, causing willful damage to your Funscreen is a criminal offense. Your threat has been recorded. Just hours later, a visit from the police ruined Danny's dad's chance of winning a life-changing jackpot when a policeman entered the house uninvited and was picked up as an unauthorized participant in the big quiz. The reason for the policeman's visit was the real kicker, though. When Danny stood in front of the Funscreen with puffy eyes and slurred a few words, the unit detected illicit drug use and began a digital investigation. The system quickly linked Danny's condition to a conversation recorded by his friend Kevin's Funscreen, in which they discussed what they were planning to smoke. Though still technically grounded since that night, Danny was now on the way to Kevin's house to watch a big cage-fighting event under the pretense of studying for an important test. This lie would fall apart as soon as the 80 funfair credits that Danny was going to pay to watch the fight were deducted from the family's shared digital wallet, but that was tomorrow's problem. Of the 5 fights taking place, Danny only really cared about the 4th. It featured Kevin's cousin Joe, known universally as Joe Boy, who had grown up just a few miles from Danny. It was Joe Boy's biggest ever fight by far, and Danny was so desperate to see it that he didn't even grudge paying. He arrived at Kevin's house to find Kevin and his dad, Mike, attentively watching the 3rd fight. Unauthorized viewer detected, their Funscreen announced. Hello, Danny. Do you wish to purchase a ticket for Mega Fight 32? Your account will be debited 80 funfair credits. Yes, Danny said. The warning notice faded. Fortunately, he had arrived during a break between rounds, so hadn't interrupted anything important. All right, Kevin said to him, looking over the couch. All right. Mike's bald head appeared round the side of his armchair. All right, Danny. You want a drink? He asked, nodding towards the 4 cans of lager sitting in a bucket of long melted ice. I probably better not, Danny said. My dad bought a drug testing kit and a breathalyzer after what happened last week. When he sees I've been watching this instead of studying, he'll definitely make me use it. Mike laughed. He's some guy. So who won the first 2 fights? Danny asked, trying to move the conversation along even though he had no idea who any of the first 4 fighters were. Mike could have said any names in the world and Danny would have nodded all the same. Haynes and Chan, no surprise. And Murphy is in total control now in the 3rd. The big one is next, though. Our Joe Boy is up against his biggest challenge yet. Danny sat down. Just like the situation in his family, Mike stayed at home all day watching ads while his wife went to the real-world job she was lucky enough to still have. Unlike Danny's dad, Mike was a, quote, bits and pieces here and there kind of guy who was fairly accustomed to long spells of unemployment. What he wasn't and would never be accustomed to was the Funscreen, which he hated with a passion Danny knew only too well. 3 winners out of 3 so far, Mike announced when the third fight ended with a unanimous decision. 2 more, and that bum screen is out of here. Bum screen was a common slang term for Funscreens, referencing their unshakable association with welfare claimants. Mike's derision was aimed at the screen rather than the people who were forced to use it. He was one of them, after all. But Danny had terms like bum screen boy fired at him too often at school to have any inclination to use them himself. "What are you talking about?" Kevin said. "I've got a few quid on a 5-fight acca. Joe Boy is the big one. If he does himself justice in the next fight, it's all riding on the 5th. "How many credits will you win?" Danny asked. "Will it really be enough that you won't need to keep watching ads?" "Not credits. Cash. I put the bet on at the bookies. The odds you get through the fun screen are a joke. See, look, it's giving 4-1 for Joe Boy to pull it off. I got 11-2. That's a huge difference. An extra £150 for every 100 you put on." "100?" Kevin asked, looking at his dad in disbelief. "How much have you got on this?" "In total, £300. "What's the return?" "If Joe Boy and Marcello both win, we're looking at just over 19 grand. Kevin and Danny looked at each other. Kevin spoke for them both. 19 grand? £19,617 and 23 pence, to be exact," Mike said, looking at his betting slip. "And we're already 3/5 of the way there!" Kevin yelled excitedly. "Not really. The 3 so far are all favorites, 6-10, 8-13, and 8-15. Joe Boy is 11-2, like I said, and Marcello is 2-1. Danny didn't really understand much about the odds, but Mike seemed keen to downplay his chances. "You must think they've got a decent chance if you pick them, though," he said. "Right?" Mike nodded intently. "Right. Joe Boy is only the price he is because the bookies don't know him like we do. If he's alive in the last round, he wins the fight. Simple as that. And Marcello is overpriced, too. He's the hungrier fighter in the main event." Everything suddenly felt intense, like Danny was sitting at ringside soaking up the big fight atmosphere. One thing that no one could deny about the fun screen was the immersive quality of the picture and sound. Every detail came through. Throughout Joe Boy's walk to the ring, during which he was booed by most of the crowd for daring to be matched against their hometown hero, Kevin and Mike were silent. Danny wanted Joe Boy to do well because he had a vague memory of playing cards with him over a decade ago. But Joe Boy was Mike's nephew, his only brother's only son. Mike had seen him grow up and overcome every obstacle in his way, whether it was a lack of funds hampering his early technical development or countless coaches telling him he was too small to make it. For Mike, this was about much more than money. Even though Joe Boy got the better of the first round, Danny found the viewing uncomfortable. He didn't really have the stomach for seeing people beat the hell out of each other, and had only come round to watch the event because Joe Boy was fighting. But now that Joe Boy's fight had arrived, Danny found it harder to watch than the one before. He winced every time Joe Boy took a blow. "He just has to stay away from that armbar," Mike said to Kevin after the first round. "Submission defense is his only weakness. If he doesn't tap, he doesn't lose." The second round didn't go to plan as Joe Boy's opponent dominated from start to finish. Joe Boy survived the onslaught, though, which gave Mike hope. Midway through the third and final round, the commentators made clear that Joe Boy had no chance of winning a decision. If he was going to win, it would have to be by stoppage. They talked about the size of his heart and how he had done so well to make it this far against a more experienced opponent who was a class above anyone else he'd faced in the past. "Watch the armbar!" Mike screamed at the fun screen, as though Joe Boy might hear him if he shouted loud enough. But just as his opponent went to lock it in, Joe Boy sent a sudden and ferocious elbow into the bridge of his nose, sending him flailing. "Yes!" Mike yelled, jumping to his feet. "Now, Joe Boy! Get it on him! End it! Finish him!" After 4 or 5 unanswered blows, the referee stepped in to pull Joe Boy away from his defenseless opponent, then raised his hand in victory. Mike stood speechless for several seconds until first Kevin and then Danny rushed over to hug him in celebration. They all jumped around like kids on a trampoline, almost mirroring the images of Joe Boy and his trainers that were playing on the fun screen behind them. Cheers greeted the formal announcement of Joe Boy's victory. It wasn't quite a Rocky IV level of turnaround, but his gutsy performance had won the respect of many of the fans who had jeered him not much earlier. When the immediate euphoria faded, Kevin had a question for his dad. "How much would you have won if the £300 was just on those first 4 fights?" "You can't think like that," Mike said. "The bet is all 5. "I'm just saying, if." "Fine. It would have been 6.5 grand. "Can you cash it out?" Kevin asked. Mike shook his head. "And I wouldn't if I could. Marcelo is overpriced here. I'm telling you, he's the hungrier fighter." "But Calazar's world champ." "Only because he's never fought Marcelo." Danny stood quietly, ignorant to the details of the upcoming fight and awed by the level of money riding on it. There were many ways the title fight could have gone, but no one, not even Mike, had realistically expected that Marcelo might win it in 9 seconds. The scenes of celebratory bedlam following Marcelo's incredible victory made the explosion of joy after Joe Boy's win look like restrained applause. Kevin broke a lamp in his careless excitement, while Mike alternated between standing still with his hands in the air and punching cushions on the couch while shouting, "Yes!" as loudly as he could. Danny didn't know what to do. Until the chaotic initial celebrations died down, that was, at which point he knew exactly what he wanted to do. "Are you really getting rid of your fun screen?" he asked. "Damn right," Mike said, grinning a bigger smile than Dan had ever seen on anyone. "It would take me about 5 years to earn this much watching ads. To hell with the piece of crap." Dan walked over to the socket on the wall and unplugged the fun screen so it wouldn't hear what he was about to say. "Can I smash my fist through the middle of it before you throw it out?" Mike started laughing, then saw that Danny was serious. "It would mean a lot," Danny said. "Yeah," Kevin chimed in, excited but serious. "Can we?" Danny didn't mind the idea of sharing his long-awaited fun screen-killing moment with Kevin, who had just as much reason to hate it as he did. "Why not?" Mike said. "But not with your fists," he added when the boys reacted to his permission by high-fiving. Danny's dad wasn't overly keen on him spending too much time at Kevin's house, partly because he wasn't overly keen on Kevin's dad, sometimes dismissing him as, quote, the kind of man who did this and that. But fortunately for Danny, it turned out that Mike, as the kind of man who bet £300 he couldn't really afford to lose on a 5-fight accumulator, also turned out to be the kind of man who kept 2 baseball bats in his hall cupboard. He handed one to Danny and the other to Kevin. They walked over to the fun screen and stood gleefully in front of it. "Our good friends at Kevin and Danny's Baseball Emporium would love to show you their latest range of limited edition bats," Kevin said, aping the fun screen's voice. "You will receive 0 funfair credits for viewing this placement." "On 3, Danny said, loosening his shoulders. Kevin nodded. 1? Danny looked at the screen and thought about everything it represented. The mean-spirited ads, the dehumanization, the spying. And it wasn't only about what Kevin's fun screen represented in an abstract sense, because this was the very unit that had eavesdropped on Danny and Kevin's phone conversation, then linked what they were talking about to the puffy eyes and blurred speech which Danny's fun screen noticed a few hours later. If Danny couldn't smash his own fun screen to pieces, smashing Kevin's really was the next best thing. 2? Danny wiggled his bat. "I am gonna enjoy this," he said. And then, one beautiful second later, in the middle of his best friend's living room, Danny Birch closed his eyes and swung for the fences. Thank you for listening to Sycamore X. Written by Craig A. Falconer. Narrated by Stephen Barnett. Text copyright 2015 by Craig Falconer. Production copyright 2023 by Craig Falconer.